Picture a glowing computer screen in a sterile, climate-controlled office in Brussels. On that screen, a flashing red notification indicates a blocked transaction. A keystroke made by an invisible bureaucrat thousands of miles away has just denied a sovereign nation the ability to purchase essential agricultural machinery. Now, contrast that cold, digital denial with a heavy, solid bar of pure yellow gold resting on a wooden table under the hot sun of Ouagadougou. One is an illusion of control based on digital numbers. The other is undeniable physical reality. For decades, the global financial system has operated on a simple, ruthless premise. If you do not comply with the political and economic demands of the West, you are locked out of the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, commonly known as the SWIFT system. You are starved of dollars. You are blocked from euros. You are essentially placed under a modern economic siege. This is exactly the weapon that was aimed at Burkina Faso. The nation desperately needed heavy agricultural equipment to achieve food security and break the cycle of dependency. They needed tractors to break the hard earth, to plant seeds, and to feed a rapidly growing population. They attempted to purchase this machinery on the international open market, but the unseen hands of the global financial architecture moved to block them. The dollar was weaponized. The message from Western financial institutions was clear. Submit to our diplomatic demands, accept our structural adjustment programs, or your fields will remain unplowed and your people will remain hungry. If this story matters for Africa, press like so more people see it. But the architects of this financial blockade severely underestimated the leadership in Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré understood a fundamental truth about wealth that the modern world has seemingly forgotten. True wealth is not a digital digit in a European bank account, subject to the whims of foreign politicians. True wealth is what you can pull from the earth. Consider the story of a gold miner in the rural western region of Burkina Faso. For generations, men in his family have descended into the dark, sweltering earth. With calloused hands and aching backs, they extracted raw gold from the veins of the land. Historically, that gold was immediately loaded onto heavily guarded airplanes. It was flown out of the country, destined for the deep, secure vaults of Switzerland, London, or New York to bolster foreign reserves. The physical wealth of Africa was constantly traded for paper promises and digital credits that could be frozen at a moment's notice. The miner sweated in the dark, the European banker profited in the light, and the African farmer still plowed his field by hand. Traoré looked at this exploitative system and decided it was time to break the wheel. The Western financial institutions thought they had trapped Burkina Faso in an inescapable corner. They believed that by cutting off access to the digital dollar, they could force a proud nation to its knees. They assumed that without their explicit permission and their currency, international trade was mathematically impossible. But how does a nation without access to the global digital banking system feed its people and build its future? The answer came with a shockwave that reverberated from the Sahel all the way to Wall Street and the financial districts of London. Ibrahim Traoré bypassed the dollar entirely. He completely ignored the SWIFT system and the oversight of the International Monetary Fund. Instead, he executed one of the most brilliant and audacious geopolitical moves of the 21st century. He took the raw, physical gold of Burkina Faso and traded it directly for the heavy machinery the country desperately needed. He established a direct, sovereign barter agreement with non-Western manufacturing partners. There were no intermediate banks taking a percentage. There were no foreign policy conditions attached. There were no digital currency conversions subject to foreign treasury oversight. It was a pure, unadulterated exchange of physical value. Millions of dollars worth of pure African gold were exchanged directly for thousands of heavy-duty agricultural tractors. When the first massive shipment of these machines arrived, the reaction on the ground was nothing short of electric. Imagine a farmer named Seydou in a remote village near Bobo Dioulasso. Seydou is 60 years old. For 40 years, he has worked the hard, dry soil with nothing but a short-handled hoe. His back bears the permanent curve of a lifetime of grueling manual labor. He has listened to decades of foreign aid workers and politicians making empty promises about agricultural modernization, while his crop yields barely kept his family alive. Then, one morning, the ground shakes. A massive, roaring, green and yellow tractor rolls into his village, kicking up the red dust. Seydou approaches it, placing his weathered hand on the warm metal of the engine hood. He is told by local officials that this machine does not belong to a foreign corporation. It does not come with a crippling high-interest loan from the World Bank. It was purchased outright with the gold mined from his own country's soil. For the first time in his life, Seydou sees the tangible wealth of Africa working directly for the people of Africa. The pride in his eyes is mirrored across the entire nation. The people of Burkina Faso realized they had broken a massive psychological chain. Meanwhile, the reaction in the corridors of power in Washington and Paris was a mixture of absolute confusion and rising panic. Financial analysts and geopolitical strategists were stunned by the simplicity and effectiveness of the maneuver. The entire architecture of Western financial dominance relies heavily on the assumption that global trade must absolutely be conducted in dollars or euros. The SWIFT system is only powerful if nations are forced to rely upon it. By conducting a massive transaction using physical gold, Burkina Faso had just exposed a fatal flaw in the Western financial weapon. You cannot freeze a physical gold bar that is already secured on a cargo plane heading to a sovereign trade partner. You cannot sanction a tractor that has already been unloaded at a port and is driving steadily toward a rural farm. The illusion of absolute Western financial control was shattered in broad daylight. Financial newspapers scrambled to explain how a developing African nation had managed to completely outmaneuver the most sophisticated financial blockades on Earth. They realized that the CFA franc monopoly, the colonial currency system that has drained West African wealth for decades, was losing its ultimate grip. The people of Burkina Faso were not just surviving the economic sanctions, they were actively thriving entirely outside the system meant to contain them. What happens when the architects of the global financial system realize their greatest weapon has just been disarmed? The immediate response from the West was a rapid and aggressive diplomatic escalation. Emergency meetings were quickly convened behind closed doors at the United States Department of the Treasury and the headquarters of the European Central Bank. Diplomats in Brussels drafted frantic memos. The fear among these institutions was palpable and deep. If Burkina Faso successfully proved that a nation could survive, modernize, and trade without the dollar, without the euro, and without Western banking systems, the entire neo-colonial financial structure would be at risk of imminent collapse. Western leaders began issuing veiled warnings through international media. They spoke ominously of secondary sanctions. They threatened to penalize any international logistics companies, insurers, or shipping lines that facilitated these direct gold for goods transfers. They attempted to use their considerable influence within the World Trade Organization to label the sovereign transaction as irregular, dangerous, or illicit. Western intelligence agencies were reportedly tasked with tracking the physical movement of the gold, desperately trying to find a logistical choke point where they could intervene and stop the flow of heavy machinery into West Africa. The pressure was immense and coordinated. The geopolitical heavyweights of the world were bearing down on Ouagadougou, determined to crush this rebellion against the fiat currency system before it could inspire other resource-rich nations to do the same. But amidst this raging storm of Western panic and diplomatic threats, the response from Ibrahim Traoré and the government of Burkina Faso was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They did not shout. They did not issue angry counterthreats or engage in petty diplomatic squabbles. They simply remained calm. Tell me what you think about this. Comment your honest take. This unshakable calmness was their ultimate power. While Western politicians screamed into microphones about international norms and financial regulations, Burkina Faso simply broadcasted high-definition television footage of the new tractors plowing thousands of acres of previously unused, fertile land. They showed local engineers training young Burkinabe farmers how to maintain and repair the heavy diesel engines. They showed the tangible, undeniable proof of national progress. The silence from the presidential palace in Ouagadougou was deafening to the West. It was the heavy, confident silence of a leadership that knows it holds the ultimate high ground. They possessed real gold. They had acquired real tractors, and they were growing real food in their own soil. The West, in contrast, only possessed paper threats and digital anger. This unshakable resolve triggered a massive wave of relief and unity across the African continent. The citizens of neighboring nations within the alliance of Sahel states, particularly Mali and Niger, watched the events unfold with intense pride. They saw a fellow African nation standing incredibly tall against the combined giants of global finance and winning decisively. The military and political leaders in Bamako and Niamey quickly realized the profound, world-shifting implications of this gold pact. Mali holds vast, untapped gold reserves. Niger possesses critical uranium and massive oil deposits. For the very first time in modern history, a clear and proven blueprint existed for bypassing the exploitative financial systems that had deliberately kept their populations impoverished for generations. The unity among the Sahel states rapidly solidified. They were no longer just a military alliance formed to combat regional terrorism. They were rapidly transforming into an economic fortress based on hard assets, mutual respect, and collective survival. The realization swept through the dusty streets and bustling markets of West Africa that the invisible, suffocating chains of financial dependency were finally snapping. They were actively witnessing the birth of an entirely new economic paradigm, one where the inherent wealth of the land finally serves the people who walk upon it. If physical gold can buy heavy tractors today, completely bypassing the dollar and the dictates of foreign banks, what will it buy tomorrow, and who will be left holding the empty paper? The immediate domestic transformation across Burkina Faso was nothing short of revolutionary. Within weeks of the heavy machinery arriving, the physical landscape of the nation began to change dramatically. Vast tracts of arid land, previously deemed too difficult to cultivate by hand, were suddenly being turned over by the massive steel blades of the new tractors. Young men and women who had previously migrated to overcrowded urban centers looking for scarce jobs and foreign aid began returning to their ancestral villages in massive numbers. They were not returning to the grinding poverty of their parents, but to a modernized agricultural sector that promised real yields, real income, and true dignity. Local markets, once heavily dependent on expensive imported grains dictated by global commodities traders, slowly began to see a steady influx of domestically grown produce. The psychological impact of this massive shift was profound and undeniable. For the very first time in their lives, the citizens of Burkina Faso were witnessing their own national wealth being directly converted into tangible national progress, without a single foreign banking institution taking a cut, demanding an audit, or dictating the political terms. The pride swelled in the bustling streets of Ouagadougou and echoed through the quietest rural farming communities. This was not a temporary aid package wrapped in humiliating geopolitical conditions. This was sovereign development in its purest form, built entirely on the solid, undeniable foundation of their own physical gold. But the ripple effects of this audacious economic maneuver did not stop at the borders of Burkina Faso. The shockwaves quickly spread throughout the newly formed alliance of Sahel states with the force of an earthquake. In the capital cities of Bamako and Niamey, the leadership of Mali and Niger watched this profound success with intense strategic interest and growing excitement. Both of these nations possess immense natural wealth, from vast veins of gold to critical uranium deposits, yet both have historically been chained to the exact same exploitative financial systems that Burkina Faso had just successfully bypassed. The realization was immediate, electric, and incredibly powerful. If Burkina Faso could confidently trade its gold directly for heavy tractors, then Mali could easily trade its gold for advanced civil infrastructure, and Niger could seamlessly trade its uranium for modern industrial technology. The robust framework for an entirely new, deeply independent economic bloc began to rapidly solidify across West Africa. They were laying the permanent groundwork for a regional barter network, a highly resilient system of trade based entirely on hard, tangible assets rather than the heavily manipulated and politically weaponized fiat currencies of the West. This was the absolute nightmare scenario that Western financial planners had dreaded for decades coming to life in real time. Share this with one friend who follows Africa news. The implications of this gold pact extended far beyond the dusty plains of the Sahel region. Across the broader global south, from the bustling financial centers of Brazil to the massive industrial hubs of India and the energy capitals of the Middle East, economic strategists and national security advisors were taking detailed, frantic notes. The dominance of the United States dollar in global trade relies almost entirely on the universal psychological perception that there is simply no other viable alternative for conducting international business. By successfully executing this massive gold for machinery transaction in broad daylight, Ibrahim Traoré had completely shattered that perception forever. He had publicly and undeniably proven to the entire developing world that a determined nation could step entirely outside the established international financial matrix and not only survive the resulting sanctions, but actually thrive and modernize at an unprecedented pace. Western diplomats and central bankers, who had initially viewed the Burkinabe leadership as a temporary political anomaly that could be easily starved out, now realized with chilling clarity that they were facing a highly sophisticated economic revolution. The initial panic in Washington and European capitals deepened into a cold, calculated, strategic dread. They understood perfectly well that if this resource-backed trading model were to organically spread across the entire African continent, the West would rapidly lose its primary mechanism for controlling and coercing developing nations. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank would suddenly find themselves completely irrelevant if African nations universally refused their predatory loans and simply traded their raw materials directly for the development tools they needed. They would no longer be able to freeze a sovereign nation into submission by simply clicking a button on a computer terminal in Brussels, London, or New York. The financial leverage that had defined post-colonial relations for over half a century was rapidly evaporating in the hot African sun. If the fiat dollar is no longer required to build a sovereign nation, then the empire that prints that dollar loses its absolute grip on the world stage. But how will the desperate architects of the old world order respond when their invisible financial chains finally break, and the continent they once completely controlled decides to boldly walk its own path? This unprecedented exchange of raw gold for heavy tractors is not just a passing news story about agricultural machinery or international banking regulations. It is a profound historical declaration of true independence. For generations, the dominant narrative imposed upon Africa was one of perpetual deficit. It was painted as a broken continent that supposedly needed constant saving, continuous emergency loans, and endless foreign intervention just to survive. Ibrahim Traoré has violently flipped that degrading narrative on its head. He has demonstrated to the entire watching world that Africa does not need to beg for paper money when it already rightfully owns the very earth that creates all true wealth. The core message radiating from Ouagadougou is beautifully simple, yet earth-shattering in its geopolitical implications. Your natural resources are your ultimate currency. If you hold the physical gold, you hold the ultimate power, and the global financial system is nothing but a temporary, fragile illusion if you simply refuse to play by its rigged rules. However, the path forward for Burkina Faso and the allied nations of the Sahel will not be easy, and a severe warning must be acknowledged by anyone who supports this movement. The entrenched powers that currently control the global financial system will not simply surrender their historic privileges without a massive, ruthless fight. The pressure on Ibrahim Traoré and his closest allies will undoubtedly intensify in the coming months and years. We can expect to see a drastic, coordinated escalation in economic warfare. There will likely be massive smear campaigns launched in the international media, desperately attempting to paint this sovereign economic strategy as dangerous, unstable, or somehow corrupt. Covert intelligence operations and desperate attempts to destabilize the region from within will almost certainly increase, heavily funded by those corporations and banks who stand to lose billions of dollars if the African continent fully embraces total economic autonomy. The West will aggressively use every institutional tool at its disposal, from the World Trade Organization to secondary sanctions targeting neutral shipping companies, to try and brutally force Burkina Faso back into the dollar-dominated system. But despite the gathering storm of international pressure and the looming threats of the old empires, there is a deep, profound sense of ultimate satisfaction and unshakable determination taking permanent root across the Sahel. Africa is finally prepared for this fight. They are no longer operating out of historical fear, but from a newfound position of tangible, physical strength. They have looked the financial giant directly in the eye and realized that the giant only possesses real power if the rest of the world agrees to blindly believe in its paper currency. Consider the story of a respected elder in a small, dusty village near the capital city. He sits quietly under the wide shade of a massive, ancient baobab tree, watching his young grandson playfully chase a stray chicken across the newly tilled dark earth. For his entire long life, this elder has humiliatingly watched foreign aid trucks roll into his village, delivering small bags of imported grain while telling his proud people they were simply too poor and uneducated to feed themselves. Now, he listens intently to the steady, powerful hum of a domestically owned tractor working the vast fields just beyond the village limits. He pulls his young grandson close and points a trembling finger to the massive green machine conquering the hard earth. He tells the boy that true freedom is never found on a piece of paper signed in a distant foreign capital. True freedom, he explains, is the absolute ability to plant your own seed, in your own sovereign soil, using tools purchased purely with the sweat and gold of your own people. He tells the boy that a man who can proudly feed himself will never, ever, be forced to bow to anyone. This is the profound multi-generational legacy that Ibrahim Traoré is currently building. It is an enduring legacy of absolute dignity, written not in fragile diplomatic treaties but deeply and permanently carved into the fertile soil of a rapidly rising nation. Press. Like if dignity and justice still mean something to you. The old world order relies entirely on the psychological illusion of financial dependency and perpetual debt. But when an entire nation suddenly wakes up and realizes that its own earth holds infinitely more value than the flashing digital numbers on a European bank screen, that grand illusion shatters into a million unrecoverable pieces. The gold for Tractors Pact is infinitely more than a simple bilateral trade agreement. It is the definitive, undeniable proof that true economic sovereignty is entirely possible right now. It is the brilliant spark that could quickly ignite an entire continent to finally reclaim its rightful, staggering wealth. The fundamental question that remains is no longer whether Africa can survive without the permission of the West. The only terrifying question now facing global markets is whether the West can actually survive when Africa finally decides to stop funding it. Will the rest of the world bravely embrace this new era of resource sovereignty, or will the desperate old financial empires attempt to burn everything down to maintain their fading control over a waking giant? There is a profound and heavy silence that falls over the vast red earth of the Sahel just before the seasonal rains arrive. For countless generations, this rich soil has been turned and tended by the deeply calloused hands of men and women who understand a fundamental truth about survival. They know that true wealth does not come from the gold buried deep underground, nor does it come from the foreign aid packages wrapped in political strings. True wealth comes from the fragile green shoots that push their way up to the blazing sun. Now, take a moment and contrast that vast, sun-baked African horizon with a cold, heavily air-conditioned boardroom in a towering glass skyscraper somewhere in Chicago, or perhaps Geneva. In those sterile, quiet rooms, men in tailored suits look down at massive digital spreadsheets and see the continent of Africa not as a land of sovereign, proud people, but as a captured market. They see the sovereign soil of Burkina Faso as just another line item on a quarterly profit report, a place to dump their chemical products. For decades, the relationship between these two vastly different worlds has been dictated by quiet, invisible, but incredibly heavy chain. But today, right now, that chain has been definitively shattered. Within the span of a single afternoon, Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed a historic, uncompromising decree that immediately sent shockwaves through the global financial and agricultural systems. He did not just raise tariffs on imported goods. He did not just ask politely for renegotiation of international trade terms. He signed a comprehensive document effectively banning patented, genetically modified seeds owned by Western agricultural megacorporations from ever taking root in the soil of Burkina Faso again. He ordered the absolute expulsion of the corporate monopolies that have held African agriculture hostage for nearly half a century, simultaneously launching a massive, state-backed national initiative to mass-produce indigenous, climate-resilient crops. In less than 60 seconds of applying his pen to paper, Captain Traore redefined the very meaning of independence for his people. He declared to the world that a nation that cannot feed itself on its own terms, using its own seeds, is not truly free. If this story matters for Africa, press like so more people see it. To truly understand the massive gravity of this moment, you have to look away from the capital city and look deeply into the laboratories and the sprawling fields. Consider the remarkable story of a local agricultural scientist, a man whose brilliant mind and dedication caught the attention of the most prestigious research universities in Europe. He was officially offered a highly lucrative position at a major agricultural institute in Paris. They offered him a very comfortable life, a massive guaranteed salary, and a highly prestigious title that would guarantee his security forever. All he had to do was leave his homeland behind and work on developing patented corporate crops for a massive European conglomerate. He refused them completely. He packed his bags and returned home to Ouagadougou. Today, he leads a dedicated, tireless team of young African volunteers who travel from rural village to rural village. They are not selling expensive chemicals. They are painstakingly resurrecting forgotten, completely drought-resistant ancestral seeds. They are spending their long days cataloging the traditional sorghum, millet, and cowpea varieties that sustained their ancestors long before the first European merchant ship ever reached the African coast. This young scientist and his brilliant team are proving, day by day, that African intellect and African determination can easily defeat the suffocating grip of Western agricultural patents. But what exactly happens when a proud, rising nation suddenly stands up and tells a multi-billion-dollar global industry that their most profitable, entirely captive market is now permanently closed? The reaction was immediate, and it was entirely visceral. For many years, the global agricultural system has operated on a very specific, highly lucrative, and deeply exploitative model. These massive corporations sell an African farmer a seed that has been genetically altered in a laboratory to be sterile after exactly one harvest. This cruel science means the farmer cannot save seeds from this year to plant next year. They must return to the foreign corporation, hat in hand, and buy brand new seeds every single planting season. It is, quite literally, a biological subscription model forced upon some of the hardest working farmers on Earth. Worse still, these expensive corporate seeds strictly require proprietary chemical fertilizers and highly specific toxic pesticides, all of which are manufactured and sold by the exact same foreign corporations. It is an inescapable, meticulously designed cycle of debt that drains the wealth of the village and sends it directly to Western bank accounts. The new decree signed by the government in Burkina Faso fundamentally outlaws this abusive cycle. It legally strips away the protections that allowed these foreign entities to monopolize the national food supply. In Washington, London, and Brussels, the initial response was sheer, unadulterated disbelief, followed very rapidly by extreme corporate panic. High-paid lobbyists representing the largest agricultural conglomerates in the world immediately flooded the marble halls of their respective government buildings. They absolutely could not fathom that a young military leader in the Sahel would have the absolute audacity to challenge their legal and biological dominance. They aggressively argued that Burkina Faso would face massive starvation without their direct intervention. They loudly claimed that indigenous African farming methods were backward, terribly inefficient, and downright dangerous to the stability of global supply chains. They immediately began drafting intense, coordinated pressure campaigns, demanding that foreign embassies intervene to force the government to reverse the ban. Yet, while the corporate elites panicked over lost profit margins and broken monopolies, something beautiful and deeply moving was happening across the rural farming villages of Burkina Faso. Far away from the noise and threats of international politics, there was a profound, overwhelming sense of generational relief. In a small, quiet farming community just outside of Bobo Dioulasso, An elderly farmer sat peacefully under the wide shade of an ancient baobab tree with his teenage grandson. For many long years, this elder had watched his family and his neighbors fall deeper and deeper into crippling debt trying to afford the imported chemicals required by the foreign seeds. But on the day the decree was announced, he walked slowly into his home and brought out an old, heavily sealed clay jar. Inside that jar were seeds that had been carefully, secretly preserved, hidden away from the mandates of foreign agricultural advisors and corporate salesmen. These were the true seeds of his grandfather. They were seeds that naturally knew how to wait for the unpredictable rain, seeds that perfectly recognized the local soil, seeds that truly belonged to the African people. As the old man poured them into the open hands of his grandson, he did not just pass down a lesson in agriculture. He passed down his dignity. The whole village felt an immense invisible weight lift from their tired shoulders. The constant, gnawing fear of the corporate debt collector was finally gone. How far will the global agricultural empire go to crush a righteous rebellion that threatens their absolute control over the food supply of the developing world? The answer is that the empire will attempt to use every single weapon at its extensive disposal. We are not just talking about angry diplomatic letters. We are talking about the full, crushing weight of the Western financial and legal system being brought down upon a single nation. Within a matter of weeks, global agricultural conglomerates began aggressively filing massive, complex lawsuits against Burkina Faso in international trade courts. They claimed a severe breach of international contract. They claimed rampant intellectual property theft. They arrogantly demanded hundreds of millions of dollars in immediate financial compensation for the loss of their projected future profits. Behind closed doors in Western capitals, foreign powers began discussing devastating retaliatory measures. There were serious, documented threats to illegally freeze international financial assets belonging to the sovereign state. There were highly coordinated efforts to artificially block export routes for other agricultural products, actively attempting to strangle the economy of Burkina Faso into desperate submission. The World Trade Organization in Geneva was flooded with emergency legal filings, all specifically designed to make a permanent, terrifying example out of Captain Traore and his administration. The grim message from the West was brutally clear to anyone paying attention. If you dare to defy the corporate seed monopoly, we will financially isolate you, we will systematically bankrupt you, and we will break your spirit. This was the moment of maximum, suffocating pressure. This was the exact moment where, historically speaking, many past leaders in the developing world would inevitably fold under the immense stress, publicly apologize, and quietly sign a brand new, highly restrictive deal with the foreign corporations. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not fold. In the absolute face of overwhelming international threats and financial blackmail, the leadership in Burkina Faso responded with a profound, almost terrifying calm. And as anyone who studies history knows, in the realm of high-stakes geopolitics, sometimes absolute calm is the most devastating weapon of all. Traoré did not go on international television to shout angrily at the West. He did not engage in predictable, theatrical displays of political outrage. He simply ignored their demands. Instead, he quietly and efficiently redirected massive amounts of state funds to vastly accelerate the building of independent, nationally owned agricultural research centers. He stood before his people and presented cold, hard, verifiable scientific data. The government officially released comprehensive, peer-reviewed studies proving conclusively that indigenous seeds, when properly supported with local organic farming methods, could easily yield just as much food as the genetically modified imports. Furthermore, these local methods actually preserved the long-term health of the soil and drastically protected the fragile underground water supply. The African response was entirely organized, entirely methodical, and completely immune to foreign intimidation. They proved that they did not need permission to exist. If you disagree, say it clearly in the comments. All views matter. This quiet, fiercely intelligent defiance is exactly what the corporate monopolies feared most in the world. They know exactly how to fight a chaotic, disorganized rebellion, but they have absolutely no idea how to fight a highly organized, scientifically backed movement for absolute national self-reliance. As the Western legal threats grew louder and more desperate, the people of Burkina Faso grew significantly more united. Across the entire nation, powerful agricultural cooperatives formed naturally. Farmers who had once been intentionally forced to compete against each other for scarce, high-interest corporate loans were now openly sharing traditional seeds, sharing heavy farming equipment, and sharing vital generational knowledge. There was a palpable, surging pride sweeping through the vast fields and busy market squares. It was the absolute, undeniable realization that they did not need saving by foreign corporations or international aid organizations. They already had absolutely everything they needed right there in the rich, red earth beneath their feet. This profound national unity quickly became an impenetrable, unbreakable shield. When the international trade courts in Europe sent their official legal summons, demanding an answer for the banished corporations, the African legal teams did not flinch. They simply and firmly stated that the basic survival and food security of a sovereign nation permanently supersedes the artificial patents of a foreign corporation. The everyday people stood firmly and proudly behind their government, deeply knowing that the temporary, manufactured pain of international trade sanctions was a very small price to pay for eternal, generational agricultural freedom. If a single determined nation in the heart of the Sahel can successfully break the heavy chains of corporate agriculture and survive the coordinated wrath of the global elite, who will be the very next to stand up, and will the Western world ever be able to stop them? The immediate, on-the-ground reality in Burkina Faso, following the sudden expulsion of Western agricultural monopolies, has been nothing short of a massive, nationwide transformation that defies all conventional economic expectations. For the very first time in multiple decades, the bustling, vibrant local markets in Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and countless rural towns are not flooded with expensive, imported foreign goods that slowly drain the local economy of its vital wealth. Instead, these markets are absolutely overflowing with highly resilient, locally grown indigenous crops. The very physical landscape of the country is visibly shifting before the eyes of the world. Massive tracts of rich African land that were previously exhausted, degraded, and stripped of their natural biological nutrients by harsh, proprietary chemical fertilizers are now being carefully and lovingly rehabilitated. The people are exclusively using traditional organic methods passed down through countless generations of proud farmers. Young men and women, who only a few short years ago would have desperately sought extremely dangerous migration routes to Europe simply to escape crushing rural poverty, are now eagerly returning to their ancestral lands with an immense, unprecedented sense of national purpose. They are not looking for foreign charity. They are actively building a brand new, completely self-reliant domestic economy entirely from the ground up, proving that the African soil has always possessed the immense power to sustain its own people. In the newly expanded and heavily funded agricultural schools and research universities across the nation, the entire academic curriculum has been fundamentally rewritten by African scholars. Western textbooks that exclusively promoted genetically modified seeds and permanent chemical dependency have been permanently thrown out of the classrooms. In their place, highly motivated students are intensely studying advanced local ecology, highly sophisticated rainwater conservation techniques, and the absolutely incredible, largely untapped genetic potential of native African plant species. They are learning the profound truth that their ancestors were never primitive farmers who needed desperate foreign intervention, but rather highly skilled, sophisticated agronomists who successfully and sustainably managed the harsh, unforgiving Sahel environment for centuries without a single drop of imported synthetic chemicals. This is not just a mere agricultural shift. It is a profound, deeply necessary psychological liberation for an entire generation. It is the complete, systematic dismantling of a deeply ingrained neo-colonial mindset that falsely and maliciously taught generations of Africans that foreign products and foreign ideas were inherently superior to their own rich heritage. Share this in your group. Let others decide for themselves. But the true, deeply hidden reason why Western capitals and massive corporate boardrooms are currently experiencing such unprecedented, frantic levels of absolute panic is not simply about the lost financial revenue within the borders of Burkina Faso. What truly terrifies the wealthy executives of multinational conglomerates is the massive, undeniable, and entirely unstoppable ripple effect this bold sovereign move is already having across the entire African continent. The alliance of Sahel states, comprising the rapidly aligning nations of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, currently operates as a deeply unified, highly coordinated political and economic front. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré successfully and publicly proves that a sovereign African nation can legally and economically sever its heavy ties with predatory agricultural monopolies and actually thrive in the aftermath, he provides a highly dangerous, fully tested blueprint for his closest regional allies. National leaders and top agricultural ministers in Mali and Niger are currently watching this massive, unprecedented agricultural experiment with intense, highly focused interest. They have already begun serious, high-level, confidential discussions about implementing exact, identical copies of the Seed Sovereignty Decree entirely within their own national borders. They clearly see that the heavy chains of corporate farming can indeed be broken. This profound movement of agricultural independence is rapidly spreading far beyond the immediate borders of the Sahel region. Across the broader global south, from the vast, struggling farming communities in South America to the rural, debt-ridden agricultural hubs in Southeast Asia, developing nations are paying very close, quiet attention. For countless decades, they have all suffered under the exact same exploitative corporate monopolies. They have all watched helplessly as their hardworking local farmers were ruthlessly driven into permanent, inescapable financial debt by the exact same Western conglomerates. Now, for the first time in modern history, they are seeing a highly effective, deeply courageous, and entirely legal alternative playing out in real time on the world stage. Burkina Faso has suddenly and unexpectedly become the undeniable, beating heart of a massive global resistance movement against corporate agricultural dominance. When international trade delegates from developing nations meet at various global economic summits today, they are no longer whispering in quiet, defeated resignation. They are actively, openly discussing the Burkina Faso model. They are actively strategizing on how to legally dismantle foreign monopolies in their own sovereign countries, using the exact legal and scientific precedents currently being established by Captain Traoré and his dedicated administration. The massive Western conglomerates are acutely aware of this rapidly growing, highly existential threat to their absolute global dominance over the world food supply. They deeply understand the terrifying mathematical reality that if Burkina Faso ultimately succeeds, the entire, highly lucrative, multi-billion-dollar global system of patented agricultural dependency will inevitably begin to collapse like a fragile, poorly constructed house of cards. They are currently pulling every single political, legal, and economic lever actively available to them in a desperate bid to ensure this African rebellion fails spectacularly and publicly. They are heavily funding massive, highly targeted misinformation campaigns across major international media outlets, desperately trying to paint Captain Traoré as a dangerous, chaotic, economically illiterate radical rather than a rational, highly protective national leader acting strictly in the best interests of his people. They are actively leaning on massive, heavily influential global financial institutions, attempting to aggressively leverage international debt and developmental aid to force Burkina Faso back into subservient compliance. They are threatening to withhold vital infrastructure loans, attempting to quietly organize regional trade blockades, and using every diplomatic threat in their extensive arsenal to break the powerful will of the African farmer. But what exactly happens to the established global order when an entire, vast continent simply refuses to buy what the dying empire is aggressively selling, and courageously chooses to plant its own sovereign seeds of defiance instead? Ultimately, this historic, unprecedented decision to completely ban Western mega-farms and forcefully resurrect native African agriculture is not merely a passing news story about farming techniques, and it is certainly not just a minor, forgettable dispute over international trade regulations. It is a deeply profound, fiercely uncompromising, and entirely permanent declaration of fundamental human dignity. It is a powerful, undeniable reminder to the entire world that true national sovereignty does not exist on a fragile piece of paper, signed at a distant, heavily guarded diplomatic conference in Europe. True, unbreakable sovereignty is physically rooted deeply in the native soil. It is strictly measured by a sovereign nation's absolute ability to feed its own children, using its own resources without ever having to beg for permission or borrow money from wealthy foreign entities. For far too long, the African continent has been arrogantly treated as a massive, passive, highly profitable laboratory for Western corporate interests to test their chemicals and extract their immense wealth. But the long, dark era of passive African compliance has definitively and permanently ended. We must be entirely clear and brutally honest about the intense, deeply turbulent days that inevitably lie ahead for this brave nation. The massive, multi-billion-dollar global forces that currently benefit immensely from African dependency will absolutely not surrender their immense power and their massive profit margins quietly. The external financial pressure on Burkina Faso will inevitably increase in the coming months. There will be highly coordinated, deeply aggressive, and entirely ruthless attempts to politically isolate the nation on the world stage, to severely restrict their vital access to international export markets, and to heavily punish their bold military and civilian leadership. The wealthy global empire will relentlessly strike back with every single tool of economic warfare it currently possesses. They will attempt to artificially create domestic food shortages. They will attempt to heavily sponsor internal political division, and they will try with all their might to break the remarkable, soaring spirit of the newly liberated African people. Yet, despite the massive, looming storms of intense international retaliation and the very real threats of economic hardship, there is a profound, unshakable, and deeply moving sense of deeply rooted satisfaction spreading rapidly across the Sahel. The hard-working people of Burkina Faso are entirely prepared for the long, difficult road ahead. They are not acting out of blind, unthinking anger, nor are they acting out of sudden emotional impulse. They are acting out of cold, highly calculated, and profoundly deep determination. They deeply understand the extraordinarily high price of true, lasting independence, and they have universally, collectively decided that it is a price they are more than willing to pay for the sake of their grandchildren. They know that the temporary pain of Western sanctions is absolutely nothing compared to the eternal suffering of corporate slavery. Consider, for a profound moment, a deeply intimate, exceptionally quiet scene playing out right now in a small, dusty farming village located far away from the busy political capital. A weary but intensely proud mother stands in her modest, warmly lit kitchen, carefully preparing a traditional evening meal for her family. She is using the very first successful, abundant harvest of the newly resurrected indigenous seeds that her own community planted and cultivated. As she slowly works the ingredients, she knows with absolute, unwavering, and powerful certainty that absolutely no foreign corporation legally owns the food she is cooking for her blood. She knows that she does not owe a distant, wealthy Western bank a single penny for the fundamental human right to feed her own children. In that small, quiet, seemingly ordinary act of preparing a simple family meal, there is a monumental, world-changing, historic victory. She is successfully feeding her family with the undeniable, unbreakable strength and the ancient wisdom of her ancestors. The heavy, suffocating chains of the painful past have finally been broken, and the massive, endlessly fertile fields of the African future now belong entirely, completely, and forever to them. Press like and write your city below so your voice is part of this record. In the air-conditioned aisles of European supermarkets, the shelves are always full, perfectly organized and seemingly immune to the changing seasons of the world. But thousands of miles away, beneath the blazing, unforgiving sun of the Sahel, a completely different reality was supposed to unfold, dictated by the invisible hands of foreign trade commissions. In the lush, sprawling orchards of Bobo Dioulasso, a man named Seydou stood over a harvest of pure gold. This was not the mineral gold pulled from the deep earth that usually dominates global headlines, but the golden, sweet flesh of premium mangoes. For generations, farmers like Seydou and his ancestors have cultivated the soil, grown some of the finest, most sought-after fruit on the planet, and meticulously packed it into crates destined for the luxury markets of Paris, Berlin, and Rome. It was a grueling cycle of labor, completely dependent on the approval of foreign buyers. But overnight, a silent decree issued from a cold, distant bureaucratic office in Europe threatened to turn his entire life's work and the labor of thousands of his countrymen into rotting waste on the African soil. This sudden crisis was not an act of nature, a drought, or a failure of the harvest. It was a calculated act of economic execution. The European Union had suddenly and drastically changed its phytosanitary regulations regarding imported agricultural goods. On paper, buried deep within hundreds of pages of legal terminology, it was framed as a necessary measure to protect European agriculture against the spread of fruit flies and other pests. In reality, it was a highly sophisticated, invisible blockade. It was a deliberate, artificial shift in standards designed specifically to protect Spanish and Southern European growers from the fierce competition of high-quality, affordable African produce. Without any meaningful warning or transition period, 10,000 tons of premium Burkina mangoes were effectively banned from crossing the Mediterranean Sea. The gates of the European market were slammed shut. If you believe these stories need to be told, press like. The expectation in Western capitals was incredibly clear, arrogant, and historically predictable. They fully expected a panic to sweep through the streets of Ouagadougou. The architects of this policy expected the agricultural ministers from West Africa to immediately book flights to Europe, arriving with briefcases in hand to beg for grace periods, request emergency development aid to meet the new impossible standards, and ultimately submit to the economic dominance of the continent that controlled the market. For decades, this is exactly how the game of global trade was played. The West unilaterally sets the rules, changes those rules whenever it suits their domestic political needs, and Africa simply pays the price in lost wages and broken livelihoods. The European strategy was designed to break the will of a developing economy, to remind them of their assigned place at the bottom of the global supply chain as mere exporters of raw materials. But the economic strategists sitting in Brussels fundamentally misunderstood the era they were operating in, and they severely underestimated the leadership they were dealing with. They did not factor in the quiet, unyielding resolve of Ibrahim Traoré and the awakened people of Burkina Faso. They arrogantly assumed that a closed door in Europe meant a dead end for Africa. But what happens when the continent that feeds the entire world finally decides it no longer needs the West to survive? The immediate aftermath of the European ban was a tense, heavy silence across the agricultural hubs of the nation. The fruit was ripening fast, the heat was unforgiving, and the biological clock of the harvest was ticking loudly. In any previous administration, a crisis of this magnitude would have triggered an immediate collapse in local agricultural prices. Desperate farmers would have been forced to sell their pristine harvests for mere pennies to predatory local intermediaries. Or worse, they would have been forced to simply watch their entire year of backbreaking labor rot on the branch and fall to the earth. The financial devastation would have been absolute. It would have rippled through rural communities like a shockwave, emptying classrooms as families could no longer afford school tuition, and fueling the very social instability and desperation that foreign powers so often claim they want to solve through their endless, ineffective aid programs. The new European agricultural standards were a masterpiece of modern regulatory warfare. By requiring incredibly expensive, highly specific chemical treatment processes and certifications that Burkina Faso ostensibly did not possess at an industrial scale, the European Union created an artificial, impenetrable monopoly for their own domestic farmers under the false guise of public health and safety. It is nothing more than a modern, bureaucratic evolution of the old colonial extraction model. The message was clear. You are allowed to sell your resources to us only when it perfectly benefits our bottom line, and we will ruthlessly shut your economy down the very moment your success threatens our profit margins. In Washington and across European capitals, foreign policy analysts and trade economists watched the Sahel closely, waiting for the inevitable economic distress signals to broadcast from Burkina Faso. They waited for the capitulation. But those distress signals never came. Instead of dispatching teams of diplomats to plead with European trade commissions for a sliver of market access, Ibrahim Traoré mobilized a different kind of army. He mobilized engineers, industrial planners, and the raw willpower of the Burkinabe people. The government of Burkina Faso looked at the European ban and recognized it not as a devastating crisis, but as the ultimate catalyst for immediate, forced industrialization. If Europe did not want to buy fresh mangoes from Africa, Burkina Faso would simply no longer sell them fresh, perishable fruit. They would do what wealthy nations do. They would add value to their own resources. Within days of the ban, a massive, highly coordinated national effort was underway to rapidly scale up industrial dehydration and food processing capabilities across the country. State-backed financial initiatives and private domestic enterprises aligned with a single, urgent mission to save the harvest and redefine the economy. Massive industrial drying ovens, cutting machines, and processing belts were procured, activated, and expanded across the primary agricultural zones. The centuries-old raw material export model was being dismantled and replaced in real time. Back in the orchards of Bobo Dioulasso, Seydou did not have to watch his golden mangoes rot in the dirt. Instead, the packing house where he had worked his entire life underwent a miraculous transformation. The quiet, lingering despair of a canceled export season was entirely replaced by the deafening, beautiful, rhythmic roar of electric dryers and modern processing machinery. The air inside the facility no longer carried the faint, tragic smell of agricultural decay, but was filled with the rich, concentrated scent of sweet fruit being preserved. Hundreds of local workers who had gone to sleep terrified that they had lost their seasonal wages were suddenly operating advanced machinery, carefully slicing, drying, and packaging the mangoes into high-value, non-perishable consumer goods. This was the profound relief of true economic sovereignty. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of a nation taking absolute control of its own destiny. By choosing to dry the fruit rather than let it spoil, Burkina Faso instantly solved the biological problem of the harvest. The mangoes could now last for months, even years, without the need for expensive, energy-intensive refrigeration. But far more importantly, this simple industrial process exponentially increased the profit margin of the final product. A beautifully packaged, dried mango is worth significantly more on the global market than a raw one picked straight off a tree and shipped in a wooden crate. The agricultural sector was no longer just farming. It was manufacturing. But with the traditional European market deliberately closed to them, a massive question loomed over this industrial miracle. Where would this newly processed, high-value product go? How would Brussels react when they realized their ultimate economic weapon was turned into the very engine of African industrialization? The realization within Western trade offices and European ministries of agriculture was painfully slow at first, and then it arrived with sudden, shocking clarity. The expected massive surplus of rotting African fruit, which was supposed to bring the Burkinabe economy to its knees, never materialized. Instead, satellite imagery, global trade manifests, and market intelligence reports showed bustling, unprecedented activity in Burkinabe agricultural and logistical hubs. When European agricultural attachés and market analysts finally understood exactly what was happening on the ground, the geopolitical and economic shockwave was profound. Burkina Faso was not just saving its agricultural harvest, it was fundamentally and permanently rewriting its global trade map. The 10,000 tons of premium mangoes, now transformed into high-margin dried fruit, were meticulously loaded onto transport trucks and heavy cargo aircraft. But these shipments were not heading north across the Mediterranean Sea to grace the shelves of European markets. They were heading east. The government of Burkina Faso and the newly empowered local agricultural cooperatives decided to bypass the European Union entirely. They forged brand-new, direct cargo routes and trade agreements with the Middle East and the massive, hungry markets of Asia. The luxury supermarkets in Dubai, the high-end retailers across the United Arab Emirates, and the rapidly expanding consumer markets in the East eagerly and quickly absorbed the high-quality, processed African product. The European regulators and bureaucrats had fully intended to use their changing standards to force Ibrahim Traoré into a position of weakness and diplomatic submission. Instead, their arrogance completely removed Europe from the trade equation altogether. They locked themselves out of a premium supply chain. This scenario represents the ultimate nightmare for the traditional architects of global trade and Western hegemony. The entire Western economic strategy historically relies on the fundamental assumption that African nations have absolutely nowhere else to go. They deeply believe that if Paris, London, or Brussels closes its doors, Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey must inevitably starve and submit. If you disagree, say it clearly in the comments. All views matter, but Ibrahim Traoré proved to the world that the globe is incredibly vast, and the era of the European trade monopoly is permanently over. His strategic response to the mango blockade was an absolute masterclass in the calm, disciplined exercise of sovereign power. There were no furious, emotional speeches denouncing the European Union at the podiums of the World Trade Organization. There were no public spectacles of burning European flags in the streets to protest the unfair standards. There was only the cold, hard, undeniable reality of rapid industrial execution. The absolute silence of the Burkinabe government in the face of European provocation was far more intimidating to Western powers than any political threat could ever be. It signaled a total, irreversible disregard for the foreign institutions that once controlled their economic fate. The allied nations of the Alliance of Sahel states, including Mali and Niger, watched this incredible victory unfold closely. They saw with their own eyes that the fake standards, the complex regulations, and the economic blockades imposed by Western bureaucrats were not absolute laws of nature that must be obeyed. They were simply fragile illusions of power that shatter into pieces the very moment an African nation decides to stand up and build its own infrastructure. The roaring drying machines in Burkina Faso did vastly more than just preserve a harvest of fruit. They actively preserved and elevated the dignity of an entire nation. They definitively proved that true independence is never negotiated in the lavish halls of European capitals. It is forged and built with sweat on the factory floor and in the fertile fields of the homeland. As the new eastern trade routes solidified and expanded, leaving European markets permanently cut off from a premium agricultural source they once arrogantly took for granted, a powerful new reality settled over the African continent. The invisible economic chains that had bound them for over a century were finally snapping. Could this single, brilliant act of agricultural defiance be the exact blueprint that finally breaks the economic chains of the entire global South? The transformation inside Burkina Faso was not limited to the physical machinery processing the golden fruit. The psychological transformation of the population was even more profound, shattering decades of deeply ingrained conditioning. For generations, the psychological burden of dependency weighed heavily on the shoulders of every farmer, every truck driver, and every merchant in the agricultural supply chain. They had been taught, through decades of unfair trade practices, to look across the ocean for validation. They were trained to wait anxiously for the nod of approval from a European inspector before they could secure the means to feed their own families. But as the new dehydration plants hummed with steady electricity and undeniable purpose, a new, unbreakable sense of national pride took root in the red soil of the Sahel. The revenue generated from the dried mango exports to the Middle East and Asia did not disappear into the offshore accounts of foreign multinational corporations. It flowed directly back into the local economy, bypassing the traditional predatory intermediaries that historically funneled the wealth of the continent outward. The rural communities surrounding agricultural hubs like Bobo Dioulasso began to experience a rapid, visible transformation. Schools that were constantly under the threat of closing due to unpaid tuition fees suddenly saw their classrooms full of eager students, their parents finally armed with reliable, predictable income. The local markets, previously stagnant and entirely at the mercy of the volatile fluctuations of raw export prices dictated by European buyers, were now vibrant, stable, and expanding. The people of Burkina Faso realized a fundamental truth. Their labor had intrinsic, undeniable value on the global stage, and they absolutely no longer needed foreign permission to prosper. This massive domestic victory in Burkina Faso sent an immediate, undeniable shockwave across the entire West African region. The news of the roaring processing factories and the highly lucrative new eastern trade routes could not be contained by artificial colonial borders. In neighboring Mali and Niger, the other core members of the Alliance of Sahel states, government officials, and agricultural leaders watched the Burkinabe triumph with intense focus and immediate recognition. They instantly realized that the so-called European standard, the bureaucratic weapon used to keep Africa subservient, was nothing more than a paper tiger. It was an illusion of authority that could be completely neutralized with bold leadership and rapid industrial investment. The Alliance of Sahel states, previously united primarily by the urgent need for mutual military defense against terrorism, suddenly discovered a powerful, transformative new dimension to their regional unity. They had just witnessed a proven economic blueprint for absolute self-reliance. The logic was inescapable. If Burkina Faso could completely decouple its premium fruit sector from the coercive grip of the European Union, then Mali could execute the exact same strategy with its massive cotton industry, and Niger could apply the identical principle to its vast, untapped agricultural potential. The realization was revolutionary, spreading like wildfire across the intellectual and political landscape of the continent. The European market, which for over a century had arrogantly dictated the economic pulse of West Africa, was actually entirely optional. The geopolitical implications of this realization deeply terrified the traditional power centers in the West. For the European trade commissions and the bureaucratic architects sitting comfortably in Brussels, the mango blockade was originally designed to be a surgical, devastating strike. It was meant to assert absolute dominance and brutally remind Africa of its inherent dependency. Instead, their arrogance exposed a fatal, irreversible vulnerability in their own global system. By aggressively closing their doors to raw African goods, they accidentally triggered and accelerated the rapid industrialization of the very nations they sought to control. European luxury retailers and high-end consumer markets suddenly found themselves entirely cut off from one of the finest agricultural products on Earth. European importers were forced to scramble in a panic for inferior, more expensive substitutes from other regions, while the premium, newly processed Burkinabe harvest was proudly displayed and eagerly purchased in the bustling, wealthy markets of Dubai, Doha, Beijing, and across the rapidly rising economies of Asia. The West lost far more than just a reliable supply of premium fruit. They lost their primary, most effective mechanism of geopolitical leverage. They definitively lost the ability to use poverty and market access as a weapon of political coercion. Furthermore, observers in Washington watched this European blunder with growing alarm. American national security analysts recognize that when Western Europe loses its economic grip on the Sahel, the entire Western alliance loses crucial strategic ground in a resource-rich continent. They see that Ibrahim Traoré is not just fighting a trade dispute. He is actively dismantling the architecture of post-colonial dependency. If a nation cannot be threatened with starvation because its people now know exactly how to feed themselves and sell their manufactured surplus to willing buyers in the East, that nation can no longer be controlled by threats of sanctions. Share this with one friend who follows Africa news. The panic in Western capitals was palpable, echoing through the halls of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Foreign policy think tanks and economic advisors frantically scrambled to draft new strategies, facing the harsh reality that the old colonial playbook of blockades and regulatory extortion was now completely obsolete against a united, industrialized Africa. But as the Alliance of Sahel states moves aggressively to solidify these massive new global trade partnerships, a critical and highly dangerous question hangs in the air. If the traditional Western powers can no longer control the harvest and dictate the terms of survival, what extreme, unprecedented measures will they attempt to deploy to regain control of the African future? The story of the Burkinabe mangoes is not simply an inspiring agricultural anecdote. It is a defining, monumental chapter in the history of modern African sovereignty. It serves as an undeniable historical testament to the profound truth that the wealth and security of a nation do not lie in begging for market access from former colonizers, but in the intelligent, fearless, and independent management of its own resources. Ibrahim Traoré and the resilient, hardworking people of Burkina Faso proved to the entire globe that when a nation firmly stops asking for permission to survive and begins aggressively building the infrastructure to thrive, the entire geopolitical balance of power inevitably and permanently shifts. This victory, however magnificent, is not the end of the conflict. It is merely the opening engagement in a much larger, generational struggle for total economic independence and continental dignity. The architects of the old global order will never surrender their influence or their immense profits quietly. We must expect that as the alliance of Sahel states continues to rapidly industrialize and assert its autonomy, the external pressure from the West will only increase in severity and complexity. Western financial institutions, suddenly terrified by the very real prospect of an independent, self-funded African continent that no longer requires their predatory loans, will undoubtedly attempt to deploy more sophisticated economic weapons. We must be prepared to see heavily coordinated international media smear campaigns specifically designed to discredit African manufacturing standards and cast doubt on their rising industries. We may witness covert, highly funded attempts to disrupt the newly established Eastern trade routes, or calculated efforts to manipulate regional currency markets to artificially undermine this incredible, hard-won progress. The global empire of debt and enforced dependency will inevitably fight back with everything it has at its disposal. But there is a profound, fundamental difference now. Africa is awake, and Africa is prepared. The psychological chains of fear, compliance, and inferiority have been permanently shattered. The men and women of Burkina Faso have tasted the sweet, undeniable reward of their own sovereign labor, and they will absolutely never return to the dark fields of dependency. They are standing tall on their own soil, fully aware of their immense collective strength, and they are no longer intimidated by the bureaucratic threats or financial ultimatums of foreign capitals. Back in the bustling packing facility in Bobo Dioulasso, the transformation of an industry and a people is complete. Seydou, the man who only weeks ago stared at a golden harvest he deeply feared would rot under the unforgiving sun, now stands proudly at the end of a state-of-the-art, high-capacity production line. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of working the demanding soil, carefully and deliberately place a beautifully designed premium label onto a sealed package of high-grade dried fruit. The label does not bear the name of a foreign multinational corporation, nor does it carry the logo of a European import agency that dictates its worth. It proudly reads, in bold, uncompromising letters, "Made in Burkina Faso," as he firmly places the box onto a shipping pallet destined for a luxury market thousands of miles away in the Middle East. A quiet, profound smile crosses his face. It is the smile of a man who knows, with absolute certainty, that he is no longer just passing down a dusty plot of land to his children. He is passing down a thriving, modern industry. He is passing down a powerful legacy of dignity, economic strength, and unwavering independence. The world is changing rapidly, shifting on its axis, and the old masters of global trade are suddenly finding themselves standing on the outside looking in, entirely irrelevant to the future they once thought they owned. Will the rest of the world wake up to the undeniable reality of a rising, self-sufficient Africa, or will they stubbornly continue to blind themselves with the arrogant, fading illusions of the past? If you stood with Africa today, press like before you go. Good day, everyone. Whether you are tuning in from the continent of Africa, from the diaspora, or from anywhere else around the world, welcome back to the channel. I need you to sit down for this one, because what I'm about to tell you is not just about agriculture. It is not just about trade, or tariffs, or regional economics. It is about power. It is about survival. It is about the ultimate geopolitical weapon in the modern world, which is food. Every single African country will have to answer a very simple yet brutal question sooner or later. Can you feed yourself? And if you cannot feed your own people, then who really controls your future? For decades, we have been told that true power comes from military alliances, or from sitting at the table with the World Bank, or from securing massive loans from the International Monetary Fund. But recent events are proving that true power is much simpler. True power is a full granary. True power is the ability to close your border and know your people will not starve. On March the 16th, 2026, the government of Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, issued a joint directive. It was signed by the country's trade minister and the minister of agriculture. The directive announced an immediate, indefinite ban on the export of fresh tomatoes across the entire national territory. Every export permit was canceled. Every special authorization was suspended immediately. Transporters with existing, legally binding contracts were given exactly 2 weeks to finish their shipments. After that 14-day window, nothing leaves the country. Any individual or business caught violating the directive faces severe legal sanctions. And the government took it a step further. Any tomato seized in breach of the ban will be confiscated and sent directly, completely free of charge, to feed the military troops and the patients in national hospitals. The government even set up toll-free telephone lines so that ordinary citizens can report violators and smugglers directly to the authorities. That is how serious this is. This is not a request. It is an ironclad command. Now, when I first saw this story breaking across the regional news networks, I did what I always do. I did not stop at what happened. I asked, why is this happening? What is Captain Ibrahim Traoré actually trying to achieve here? What does this mean for the neighboring countries that depend entirely on the agricultural output of Burkina Faso? And, most importantly, what does this tell us about the future of food, sovereignty, and dignity on this continent? If this story matters for Africa, press like so more people see it, because this story goes much, much deeper than most people realize. The mainstream media will tell you this is just a trade dispute, but they are missing the entire picture. The tomato ban did not come out of the blue. It is not a random act of hostility against neighboring states. It is the final, meticulously calculated move in a 14-month industrial chess game. While the rest of the world was focused on geopolitical drama, military operations, and international speeches, Burkina Faso was quietly, relentlessly building a domestic processing empire. They were laying the foundation for true independence. To understand this, we have to go back to November 30th, 2024. On that day, Captain Ibrahim Traoré personally inaugurated a brand new tomato processing plant in the country's second-largest city, Bobo-Dioulasso. The factory is called the Burkina Faso Tomato Company. Now, I need you to pay very close attention to how this specific factory was funded, because this changes everything we know about African development. This massive industrial facility was not built with restrictive loans from the International Monetary Fund. It was not built with conditional grants from the World Bank or the European Union. 80% of the money required to build this factory came directly from the ordinary citizens of Burkina Faso. They invested their own personal savings into the project through a revolutionary popular shareholding scheme. The remaining 20% of the funding came from the state. That is community ownership in its purest form. That is a nation putting its money where its mouth is, refusing to wait for a foreign savior. Imagine the profound dignity of that moment. Picture a young school teacher in the capital city or a small shop owner taking their modest savings. Money they could have spent on immediate, pressing family needs, and instead buying shares in a national factory. When that teacher looks at the factory, she is not just seeing a building made of concrete and steel. She is looking at her owned property. She is buying a piece of her country's economic independence. She is ensuring that her children will grow up in a country that produces what it consumes. The plant in Bobo-Dioulasso cost roughly $12 million to build. It has the immense capacity to process 6 tons of fresh tomatoes every single hour, producing 800 kilograms of high-quality tomato concentrate per hour. And they are not shipping this out in blank barrels. They are selling this under a new, proudly local brand called Aida. When a Burkinabe mother goes to the market, she no longer has to buy tomato paste imported from Italy or China. She buys Aida, a product grown on her soil, processed in her factory, and owned by her people. But the government of Ibrahim Traoré did not stop there. In December 2024, a second factory was launched in another part of the country. Those first 2 facilities alone have a combined processing capacity of 11 tons of fresh tomatoes per hour, and a third facility, which is already nearing completion, is set to open in the eastern region. That is 3 massive processing plants built in under 2 years, funded by the people, producing under a national brand. That is not just a smart agricultural policy. That is economic warfare of the most righteous kind. For decades, the African continent has been trapped in a vicious, unforgiving cycle. Extract the raw material, send it to a foreign port, watch foreign factories turn it into a finished product, and then buy it back at 10 times the original price. This cycle was designed by colonial powers and maintained by modern financial institutions to keep nations permanently impoverished. Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked at that system and shattered it. The ban on raw exports is simply the final piece of the puzzle because those brand new factories need raw materials to run at full capacity. The government made a sovereign decision that every single tomato grown on the soil of Burkina Faso will feed their own factories, provide jobs for their own youth, and stock their own grocery stores. They will no longer subsidize the food security of other nations while their own industrial capacity sits idle. But what happens when a landlocked, heavily sanctioned nation suddenly cuts off its biggest, wealthier neighbor? Let me tell you exactly what this historic decision has done to the Republic of Ghana. The impact hit the streets of Accra before the ink on the directive was even dry. Ghana imports roughly 90% of its fresh tomatoes from Burkina Faso. Let that sink in for a moment. 90%. This is particularly devastating during the dry season when local Ghanaian production drops drastically. The country's annual tomato demand is estimated at around 800,000 tons. Domestic production has never, in recent history, been able to meet that figure. According to the Chamber of Agribusiness in Ghana, the country loses hundreds of millions of dollars every single year due to this massive import dependency, post-harvest losses, and a severe lack of value addition. Hundreds of millions of dollars flow out of Ghana annually just to buy fresh tomatoes and imported tomato paste. That is not a balanced trade relationship. That is a life support machine. And Ibrahim Traoré just pulled the plug. In major markets across the Ghanaian capital and in the country's second-largest city, the panic is absolutely visible. It is a crisis of survival for the working class. Picture a market woman who has been selling vegetables for 20 years to put her children through school. She arrives at the market before dawn, expecting the usual massive transport trucks from the northern border to be offloading their goods. Instead, she finds empty spaces. She finds silence. When she finally locates a supplier who managed to get the last shipment across the border, the price is unrecognizable. The cost of a large basket of tomatoes has jumped from 3,000 cedis to over 9,000 cedis. It has tripled literally overnight. Retail prices for the everyday consumer have doubled, pushing a basic, essential staple completely out of reach for ordinary, hard-working families. Some traders are walking away from wholesale purchases altogether because they simply cannot afford the new capital requirements. Transporters and drivers who built their entire livelihood, their entire family legacy, around the cross-border agricultural route are now sitting idle. Their heavy trucks are parked indefinitely at the border, staring at a closed gate. This crisis is layered on top of existing supply chain disruptions, creating a perfect storm of scarcity. Tell me what you think about this. Comment your honest take below, because we need to document this moment in history. The response from the Ghanaian government to this unprecedented shock has been deeply revealing, and frankly, it should serve as a wake-up call to every citizen on the continent. The Ministry of Trade and Agriculture issued a formal statement saying they plan to engage Burkina Faso to find a mutually beneficial solution. They publicly urged the angry, desperate traders to remain calm. They referenced old policy documents and announced long-term production targets, hoping to grow 300,000 tons over the next 4 years. They mentioned trial cultivation programs in the eastern and central regions. Now, I want to be fair here. On paper, in a quiet office, these sound like reasonable administrative steps. But think about the harsh reality of that response in the face of a national emergency. If your neighbor controls 90% of a food item that your entire country depends on for its daily meals, and that neighbor decides tomorrow to keep everything for themselves to build their own industry, and your only immediate response is to say you will engage them in talks, It tells the world exactly where you stand. It exposes the painful fact that you never had a contingency plan. It tells us that while Burkina Faso was organizing its citizens, raising millions of dollars from ordinary people to build state-of-the-art processing plants, your government was busy writing policy documents and relying on the hard work of foreign farmers. And this is the part that should sting the absolute most for anyone watching this unfold. Ghana has significantly more fertile land than Burkina Faso. Ghana receives vastly more rainfall every single year. Ghana has better access to major water systems, rivers, and one of the largest agricultural dams in the entire West African region. The natural conditions for massive, year-round tomato farming exist right now. What does not exist is the political will, the discipline, and the visionary leadership to make it happen. Ghana's existing tomato processing facilities currently rely on locally grown tomatoes for a shocking 7% of their total capacity. Only 7%. The remaining 93% of the raw material is imported. Let that reality wash over you. A country that sits in one of the most lush, fertile agricultural belts in West Africa is importing 93% of the raw materials needed to keep its own food processing industry alive. That is not a resource problem. That is not a weather problem. That is a catastrophic leadership problem. The contrast between the two nations is staggering, and it is entirely intentional. On one side of the border, you have Captain Ibrahim Traoré operating in total, unshakable calm. He's not making angry speeches. He is using silence, precision, and state-backed infrastructure as undeniable tools of national power. The calm is the power. The ability to feed your own people, to process your own resources, and to dictate what leaves your borders gives you the ultimate leverage to negotiate on your own terms, rather than begging for survival. But this massive crisis unfolding in the markets of Ghana is just the beginning of the story. It is merely a symptom of a continent-wide disease. This tomato ban exposes a much darker, hidden vulnerability that threatens to tear apart the most populous and powerful nations on the continent. If a simple, everyday vegetable can trigger this level of panic and expose the fragility of a major economy, what happens when we look at the exact same agricultural divide tearing at the seams of Nigeria? Let us take this conversation exactly where it needs to go, because the stark reality of the tomato ban in Burkina Faso is not an isolated incident. It is a blazing warning sign for the entire continent. I want you to look at the Federal Republic of Nigeria, a massive economic powerhouse, and consider the uncomfortable, unspoken truth that divides it. There are voices in the southern part of Nigeria, voices backed by enormous oil wealth, massive commercial ports, and sprawling metropolitan cities that have argued for decades that the northern region is a financial liability. They argue that the South generates the revenue, the South drives the modern economy, and the South could easily thrive as an independent entity while the North would simply collapse under its own weight. But let me tell you what would actually happen if you drew a hard border between those regions today. The exact same terrifying scenario playing out in the markets of Ghana right now would detonate across southern Nigeria, but multiplied by a factor of 10. The fundamental truth that no amount of political rhetoric can erase is that the food keeping millions of southern Nigerians alive every single day is grown in the north. The tomatoes, the onions, the massive harvests of rice, the beans, the yams, the millet, and the overwhelming majority of the cattle. Over 21 million heads of cattle are raised in the north. The beef that ends up on a dinner plate in Lagos, the onions that are loaded onto heavy trucks and travel over 1,000 kilometers to reach southern coastal cities, they all come from the northern agricultural belt. The north holds the vast, flat plains suitable for large-scale farming. It holds the profound irrigation capacity and the generational pastoral traditions. When oil was discovered, the South rapidly transitioned. Agriculture was suddenly viewed as something tied to poverty, a relic of the past, while investments poured endlessly into real estate, banking, and petroleum. But the North kept farming. If that supply chain were ever cut, if the North suddenly decided to keep its agricultural output to feed its own rapidly growing industrial processing zones, a region of over 100 million people in the South would not just be worrying about the price of tomatoes. They would be worrying about everything simultaneously. They would be forced to import basic, daily survival food from Asia, from Europe, and from the Americas, paying exorbitant international prices in foreign currency just to keep their citizens from starving in the streets. That is not a picture of a thriving, independent economic powerhouse. That is the definition of a catastrophic food emergency. The northern region is not a liability. It is the absolute, undeniable food security backbone of the entire nation. And this is exactly the dynamic that Burkina Faso has just weaponized to secure its own future. Share this with one friend who follows Africa news, because this is the kind of analysis you will never see on mainstream television. Now, zoom out and look at the broader regional implications of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his masterful chess move. Do you think the neighboring nations of Mali and Niger are just sitting idly by, ignoring this development? Absolutely not. The alliance of Sahel states is watching closely, and they are taking meticulous notes. They are witnessing firsthand that when you stop exporting your raw, unprocessed wealth, you do not collapse. You actually force your neighbors and your international partners to respect your borders and your demands. If Burkina Faso can successfully nationalize its agricultural output, build citizen-funded factories, and process its own tomatoes into a national brand, what stops Mali from doing the exact same thing with its massive cotton fields? What stops Niger from building the infrastructure to refine its own uranium instead of shipping the raw yellow cake out to light up European cities while its own villages sit in absolute darkness? This is the profound ripple effect that is currently keeping Western diplomats awake at night. The panic in Paris, in London, and in Washington is not about tomatoes. The international community does not care if the price of a vegetable goes up in a West African market. What they care deeply about is the precedent. They are terrified of the undeniable success of the Traore doctrine. For generations, the entire global economic system has relied on Africa being the ultimate, endless supplier of cheap raw materials. The multinational corporations built their staggering wealth by buying raw African resources for pennies, processing them in Western factories, and selling the finished goods back to the African continent for massive profits. Ibrahim Traoré is systematically destroying that model, and he is doing it with the full, enthusiastic financial backing of his own people. Walk through the streets of Ouagadougou today. You will not find citizens complaining about international isolation. You will find a profound, vibrant sense of national pride. You will see young engineers who previously would have risked their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea in a desperate search for European jobs, now walking into the newly constructed processing plants in their own country. They are putting on their uniforms, operating heavy machinery, and producing goods that carry the flag of their own homeland. This domestic transformation is the ultimate shield against foreign interference. When the people own the factories, when the people fund the development, no foreign entity can threaten to pull their investments and collapse the economy. The Global South is watching this incredibly bold experiment. From the bustling streets of India to the sprawling agricultural heartlands of Brazil, developing nations are seeing a blueprint for true sovereignty. If a nation under intense pressure, facing severe security challenges and economic sanctions, can organize its citizens to build a $12 million processing empire in under 14 months, then the old excuses used by wealthy, peaceful nations are no longer valid. Anyone who speaks of true independence, of political sovereignty, cannot then turn around and beg foreign nations for the very food needed to survive the week. But what exactly awaits Burkina Faso in the days and months to come, as they boldly chart this dangerous, unprecedented path toward absolute self-reliance? We must be very clear-eyed about the future, because the empire will strike back. The international system, built on debt and dependency, does not simply surrender its leverage without a fight. The pressure on Burkina Faso is going to increase exponentially. You will see the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund release reports predicting economic disaster. You might see regional bodies attempt to impose new, punishing trade barriers. You will see diplomatic isolation tactics deployed to convince the rest of the continent that the Traore model is a dangerous anomaly that must be contained. But here is the most satisfying, profound truth of this entire saga. Africa is prepared, and Burkina Faso is not afraid. They are not negotiating from a position of weakness, hoping for a favorable loan. They are operating from a position of undeniable strength, backed by silos filling up with grain, factories running at full capacity, and a population that has tasted the unmatched dignity of self-reliance. Consider the story of an older farmer living on the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso. For 40 years, this man worked under the scorching sun, harvesting tomatoes, only to watch them rot by the side of the dirt road because the foreign buyers offered prices so low it was not even worth the cost of transportation. He spent his entire life trapped in a cycle of engineered poverty, watching the wealth of his soil enrich people he would never meet. But today, his reality has completely fractured. Today, that same farmer loads his harvest onto a truck destined not for a foreign border, but for a gleaming new factory located just a few miles away. A factory that he owns a tiny fraction of, because he bought a share with his savings. And the most beautiful part of this generational shift: the person managing the production line inside that factory, ensuring the machines process those 6 tons of tomatoes every hour, is his own grandson. That is the true meaning of this revolution. It is not just about changing trade deficits or annoying neighboring governments. It is about healing the generational trauma of exploitation. It is about restoring the dignity of the African worker. It is about ensuring that the wealth of the soil finally, permanently stays with the hands that cultivated it. Food is not just a commodity traded on international markets. Food is the most foundational element of human sovereignty. Any nation that hands that profound responsibility over to a foreign power, or even to a friendly neighbor, is building its magnificent house on borrowed ground. One single policy decision, one sudden border closure, one unexpected trade dispute, and the entire magnificent structure comes crashing down into panic and chaos. Ghana is learning that devastating lesson today, paying a terrible price for decades of neglected domestic capacity. The rest of the African continent must absorb this lesson immediately, before it is their turn to stand at a closed border, staring at empty trucks. We have to look past the daily news cycle and recognize the massive historical shift happening right before our eyes. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has drawn a line in the fertile sand, and he is daring the rest of the continent to step across it with him. Press like if dignity and justice still mean something to you. The intelligence briefings circulating through the quiet, air-conditioned corridors of Paris and Washington were remarkably confident. They detailed a precise, mathematical certainty. Within 14 days, the agricultural sector of Burkina Faso would collapse. The diesel embargo, orchestrated with surgical precision right at the dawn of the crucial planting season, was designed to be a fatal blow. A modern nation cannot feed itself without heavy machinery, and heavy machinery cannot move without diesel fuel. It was a siege tactic, refined for the modern era, intended to break the will of a defiant government by starving its people. The analysts watched their satellite feeds, waiting for the inevitable moment when the fields would sit silent and empty, waiting for the desperation to set in, waiting for Ibrahim Traoré to beg for terms. But thousands of miles away from those sterile offices, in the suffocating heat of a dusty field just outside Ouagadougou, the silence was suddenly shattered. It was not the sound of surrender. It was the deep, guttural roar of a rusted Massey Ferguson tractor coughing to life. Standing beside it was a man named Amadou. He was a veteran mechanic, a man whose hands carried the thick scars of decades spent wrestling with stubborn iron and failing gears. He wiped a mixture of sweat and dark grease from his forehead with a rag. Amadou was not waiting for a miraculous shipment of European diesel. He was not looking at the sky for aid planes. Instead, he was securing the cap on a fuel tank that he had just filled with a thick, amber liquid. It did not smell like the refined petroleum that the West had suddenly denied them. It smelled earthy, sharp, and entirely unfamiliar. It was the scent of survival. This is the reality of the new African resistance. When the traditional arteries of global commerce are weaponized against a sovereign nation, the true test of a leader and of a people is how they respond to the sudden deprivation of their lifeblood. For generations, the power dynamic was simple. The West held the fuel, and therefore the West held the power. To defy the established order meant facing the immediate threat of economic paralysis. The diesel blockade was supposed to be the ultimate reminder of this hierarchy. It was meant to demonstrate that a nation like Burkina Faso, despite its bold declarations of independence, was still ultimately tethered to the goodwill of foreign capitals for its most basic survival. If you follow Burkina Faso, press like so this story keeps moving. The timing of the embargo was a masterclass in geopolitical cruelty. In the Sahel region, the planting season is a desperately narrow window. When the first rains finally soften the hard, baked earth, millions of farmers must immediately plow the soil and sow their seeds. If that window is missed, the harvest fails. If the harvest fails, millions face the very real prospect of famine. The tractors, the irrigation pumps, the transport trucks that carry the seed and fertilizer, every single link in that vital chain depends on internal combustion engines. By cutting off the diesel supply at the exact moment the plowing had to begin, the foreign powers were not just targeting a military or a political elite. They were placing a stranglehold on the daily bread of every man, woman, and child in the country. It was a cold, calculated gamble that the fear of starvation would force the government to abandon its pursuit of total sovereignty. But how does a nation of millions, completely stripped of its industrial lifeblood, stand its ground and refuse to starve? As the days ticked by, the observers in foreign capitals expected to see the cracks forming. They expected to see long, angry lines of desperate farmers at dry fuel stations. They expected the familiar cycle of economic collapse, followed by social unrest, followed by political capitulation. The satellite imagery was scrutinized for the expected lack of movement, but the images that began to filter back to the intelligence agencies did not match their models. There was movement. There was activity. Smoke was rising from the exhaust pipes of heavy machinery. The fields were being turned. The earth was being prepared. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader who had consistently defied expectations, did not panic when the fuel shipments stopped. He did not issue desperate pleas to the international community. He did not board a plane to negotiate away his nation's dignity in exchange for a few tankers of diesel. Instead, he turned inward. He turned to the minds and the hands of his own people. He activated a quiet, desperate mobilization of Burkinabe scientists, engineers, and mechanics. In a modest, hastily equipped laboratory in the capital, an agronomist named Dr. Ouedraogo worked through a series of sleepless nights. His team was not attempting to discover a new oil reserve. They were attempting something far more revolutionary. They were working to rapidly scale up the extraction and refinement of advanced bioethanol from materials that were entirely within their control. Burkina Faso has vast amounts of agricultural waste. They had mountains of discarded cashew shells. They had endless fields of leftover sorghum stalks. For decades, these byproducts had simply been left to rot under the African sun, considered worthless debris. Now, under the immense pressure of a national crisis, this debris became a strategic asset. Dr. Ouedraogo and his team were not just brewing simple alcohol. They had to engineer a biofuel capable of running heavy, dirty, demanding diesel engines without destroying the cylinders or clogging the fuel injectors. It required a precise chemical calibration, a delicate balance of viscosity and combustion temperature, and they had to do it immediately. The genius of their solution was not just in the chemistry, but in the logistics. They did not waste precious time attempting to construct massive, multi-billion-dollar centralized refineries that would require foreign loans, foreign contractors, and years of construction. They decentralized the process. They adapted existing, smaller-scale industrial equipment. They empowered local cooperatives to begin the fermentation and distillation process using the raw materials right in their own districts. It was a nationwide mobilization of intellect and sheer willpower. The results began to manifest in the fields. Mechanics like Amadou were given the new experimental fuel. They had to adjust carburetors, modify fuel lines, and listen closely to the rhythm of the engines, tuning them to accept this radically different source of power. It was gritty, untested work that required a deep, intuitive understanding of combustion and pressure. Engines sputtered, stalled, and required constant, loving attention from men who understood machinery better than they understood politics. But slowly, steadily, the unmistakable sound of diesel engines roaring back to life echoed across the countryside. How could a nation entirely cut off from the global energy supply chain suddenly power an agricultural revolution pulling energy directly from its own soil? When the realization finally dawned on the geopolitical analysts monitoring the situation, the initial confident reports turned into urgent, panicked assessments. The ultimate weapon, the energy chokehold, had failed. The implication sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles far beyond the borders of West Africa. Urgent meetings were convened. There were hushed discussions about secondary sanctions and new methods of pressure. Because the real terror for the old colonial powers was not simply that Burkina Faso was managing to plant its crops, the terror was the precedent it was setting. If this small, landlocked nation could survive a total energy blockade by engineering its own fuel from agricultural waste, who else would realize they no longer needed the West? The true climax of this confrontation did not happen in a boardroom or at a press conference. It happened on the day the planting season officially commenced at full scale. It was a morning that will be written into the history of African independence. 1,000 tractors rolled out into the fields of Burkina Faso. They were not a fleet of shiny, state-of-the-art machines imported from foreign factories. They were a ragtag army of battered, scarred, and heavily modified workhorses. They were held together by welded, scrap metal, wire, and the brilliant improvisation of local mechanics, and every single one of them was burning fuel, grown, harvested, and refined entirely within the borders of their own country. The ground was broken. The rich red earth was turned over in long, straight furrows, ready to receive the seeds that would feed the nation. The sound of those 1,000 engines, running on cashew shells and sorghum, was deafening. It was a mechanical symphony of defiance. Ibrahim Traoré observed this mobilization with a characteristic, terrifying calmness. He did not issue boasting statements on international television. He did not taunt his adversaries. The silence of his government was its most powerful weapon. The tractors spoke on his behalf. The calm organization of his people proved that they were not merely surviving. They were operating with a cold, disciplined efficiency. This moment transcended the immediate need for fuel. It touched the very core of what it means to be a free nation. True sovereignty is not a declaration read at the United Nations. It is not a flag raised in front of a Capitol building. True sovereignty is the physical ability to plow your own field when the most powerful nations on earth tell you to starve. It is the unbreakable resolve to build an entirely new engine when they decide to take away your fuel. If that hit you, write your reaction in one sentence below. As the seeds fall into the newly turned earth and the smell of bioethanol drifts across the Sahel, the architects of the Old World Order are forced to ask themselves a terrifying question. What happens when a continent realizes that the chains of dependence were always an illusion and that Africa no longer needs the West to survive? The smoke rising from those 1,000 tractors did more than just clear the immediate threat of famine. It signaled a profound structural shift that began to ripple outward from the borders of Burkina Faso, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape of the entire continent. When a nation proves that it can decouple its most vital survival mechanism from the control of foreign powers, it does not just save its own harvest. It provides a blueprint for total economic liberation. The transformation within the country was immediate and visceral. In the bustling markets of Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, and the quiet villages of the rural provinces, a new, unspoken dignity took root. The fear of empty granaries and foreign starvation tactics evaporated, replaced by the profound realization that the power to sustain life now rested entirely in their own hands. The agricultural sector, once entirely vulnerable to the shifting moods of Paris, London, or Washington, was now insulated by the sheer ingenuity of its own people. The economic stabilization was not just about food. It was about currency retention. By eliminating the need to import millions of gallons of refined European diesel, Burkina Faso stopped the hemorrhaging of its national wealth. Capital that would have been transferred to foreign oil conglomerates was now circulating locally, paying farmers for their agricultural waste and funding local cooperatives to distill the fuel. This localized victory could not be contained. The news of the biofuel breakthrough swept across the Sahel like a powerful wind. In neighboring Mali and Niger, the other critical pillars of the alliance of Sahel states, the response was immediate and highly coordinated. They did not just send congratulatory messages of solidarity. They sent massive convoys of engineers, agronomists, and mechanics across the newly secured borders. They came to study the decentralized refineries, to examine the modified engines, and to learn directly from the men and women who had broken the embargo. The military alliance, initially forged out of a necessity to combat foreign-backed instability, was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous to the old colonial order. It was becoming a formidable alliance of shared technology, shared resources, and shared economic self-reliance. The AES was proving that regional integration was the key to ultimate survival. They began pooling their agricultural waste data, sharing their chemical extraction protocols, and collectively retrofitting their agricultural fleets to run on the very soil they were defending. The vision of a united, self-sufficient West Africa was no longer a distant political dream. It was becoming a physical reality, measured in gallons of locally produced bioethanol. Share this with one friend who follows Africa news. As the steady hum of biofuel engines began to echo from Bamako to Niamey, the concern in Western capitals deepened into a cold, hard realization of permanent loss. The diesel embargo was supposed to be the ultimate trump card, the final, undeniable proof of African dependency. It was the lever they believed they could pull whenever the nations of the Sahel strayed too far from the dictated geopolitical path. Instead, the embargo had catalyzed the exact scenario the West feared most. It had forced the Sahel to innovate its way out of the neo-colonial economic system permanently. The global implications of this survival were staggering. If three landlocked, heavily sanctioned nations, operating in one of the harshest environments on Earth, could achieve energy independence for their foundational food supply, what was stopping the rest of the global South from doing the exact same thing? Nations across South America, Southeast Asia, and the broader African continent began to watch the Burkina Faso experiment with intense, calculating interest. Delegations from nations that had spent decades crushed under the weight of International Monetary Fund structural adjustment programs began to request the technical blueprints. The monopoly on critical energy infrastructure was cracking right before the eyes of the global elite. The old powers were no longer just losing political influence in a few former colonies. They were losing their captive markets and their ability to dictate terms through the threat of engineered economic ruin. The realization that they could no longer starve a nation into compliance sent shockwaves through the boardrooms of multinational energy corporations. But the geopolitical chess match does not end simply because one piece was successfully defended. When the weapon of energy starvation fails, the empires of the West do not simply concede defeat and walk away gracefully. They regroup, they recalibrate, and they search aggressively for the next vulnerability. The analysts in Washington, Paris, and Brussels, having watched their meticulously planned diesel embargo fail spectacularly, are already drafting new strategies of containment. They are looking at global supply chains for specialized machinery parts, hoping to cut off the spark plugs and the engine blocks. They are examining the global banking systems that handle agricultural exports, preparing to choke off the financial arteries. And they are preparing new frameworks for economic warfare through the World Trade Organization. If they cannot stop the tractors from running, they will try to prevent the resulting harvest from being sold on the international market. The pressure will not vanish. It will merely change shape, becoming more insidious and deeply hidden within international law. But how will the architects of the old world order respond when they realize that the people of the Sahel are no longer afraid of their threats and are already anticipating their next move? The story of the biofuel revolution is not just a technical victory over a logistical problem. It is a profound philosophical shift in the destiny of an entire continent. For centuries, the narrative imposed upon Africa was one of inherent deficiency and perpetual need. It was a carefully constructed story that claimed Africa needed foreign capital to build its cities. foreign intelligence to govern its people, and foreign fuel to survive its seasons. Every international loan, every conditional aid package, and every skewed trade agreement was subtly laced with the venom of dependency, a constant, humiliating reminder that true power resided in capitals thousands of miles away. When Ibrahim Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso chose to build their own engine rather than beg for foreign fuel, they shattered that narrative permanently. They demonstrated to the world that sovereignty is not merely a document granted by the United Nations or a speech delivered at a global summit. True sovereignty is the dark grease on a local mechanic's hands. It is the late-night calculations of a domestic scientist refusing to sleep. It is the absolute, unyielding refusal to be starved into submission by people who have never set foot on your land. The path forward for Burkina Faso and the alliance of Sahel states will be incredibly difficult. They have chosen the hardest road possible, the road of total independence. They will face continued sabotage, relentless media manipulation, and increasingly sophisticated economic blockades. The powers that have extracted immense wealth from the African continent for generations will not surrender their privileges quietly or peacefully. There will be coordinated efforts to undermine the stability of these new governments, to fracture the hard-won unity of the people, and to ruthlessly punish the leaders who dare to chart an independent course for their nations. The economic war is far from over. In many ways, it is only entering a new, more intense, and far more dangerous phase. But there is a profound, unshakable satisfaction taking root deep in the red soil of Burkina Faso today. It is the quiet, powerful satisfaction of a people who have looked directly into the abyss of engineered starvation and walked away stronger, more united, and more capable than before. They are no longer operating from a position of panicked reaction or desperate survival. They are operating from a foundation of quiet, methodical preparation. They have realized that the most terrifying weapon the West possesses is not its military might, its aircraft carriers, or its international banks, but the psychological illusion that Africa simply cannot survive without their permission. That illusion has been burned away forever, consumed completely in the combustion chambers of 1,000 resurrected African-fueled tractors. In the fading, golden light of a long, exhausting day, Amadou, the mechanic who helped spark this grassroots revolution, stands proudly by his modified tractor. He is no longer working alone in the dust. Beside him stands his young son, watching his every move with wide, observant eyes. Amadou's hands, permanently stained with the new, earthy fuel of their liberation, gently guide his son's small hands as they adjust a vital valve on the engine block. He is not teaching the boy how to wait patiently for a foreign aid truck to arrive. He is not teaching him how to navigate a global system designed entirely to exploit him and his labor. He is passing down the sacred, undeniable knowledge of absolute self-reliance. He is teaching his son the physical mechanics of freedom. It is a profound generational transfer of power, ensuring that the next generation of Burkinabe citizens will never know the deep humiliation of begging foreign governments for the energy required to feed their own families. The future of Africa is no longer being written in the opulent boardrooms of Paris, London, or the sterile halls of the World Bank. It is being written right now in the dusty workshops, the endless fields, and the makeshift laboratories of a newly awakened continent. If a nation can forge its own survival from the dust and the debris of its own land, building life from what others discarded, can any foreign power ever truly control it again? Press like, comment your country, and let the world see who is watching. What happens when the wealthiest corporations on Earth decide that the very plants growing in your backyard no longer belong to you, but to their shareholders in a glass tower thousands of miles away? Imagine for a moment a quiet village called Yako, in the heart of Burkina Faso, where the dust settles on the leaves of a slender tree with tiny green petals. For centuries, mothers in this village have plucked those leaves to break a child's fever, or to give strength to an elderly father. They call it the miracle tree or the tree of life. It is the moringa tree. To the people of the Sahel, it is a gift from God. But to the boardroom executives of the multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry, it is something else entirely. It is a $5 billion untapped gold mine. They did not plant these trees, and they did not discover their healing powers, but they wanted to own the rights to the molecules inside them. This is the story of how one man standing at the helm of a rising African nation looked into the eyes of the global medical giants and said the word they fear most. No. Ibrahim Traoré has just signed a decree that has sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Paris and Washington. He has banned Big Pharma from patenting the essence of the moringa tree, and in doing so, he has ignited a fire for sovereignty that is spreading across the continent. Before we go deeper into how this battle was won and why it matters for every person who believes in natural justice, stay with me on this one. If this story matters for Africa Press. Like now, so more people see it, and so this message of dignity reaches every corner of the world. Think of an elderly grandmother named Mariam. She has lived in the village of Yako for 70 years, and her hands are calloused from a lifetime of working the soil. When her grandson woke up with a burning forehead and a weak cough last winter, she did not drive to a modern pharmacy to buy a plastic bottle of imported syrup that costs half a month's wages. Instead, she walked to the corner of her garden and stripped the bark and leaves from a moringa tree. She prepared a tea that has been passed down through her lineage for 10 generations. Within 2 days, the boy was running again, his eyes bright and his strength restored. Mariam did not know that at that very moment, lawyers in expensive suits were filing paperwork to claim that the specific chemical extract she used was their intellectual property. They wanted to take the ancient wisdom of Mariam's ancestors and turn it into a high-priced capsule sold back to her people in a box with a foreign logo. This is what we call biopiracy. It is the modern face of colonialism where they no longer steal the land, but they steal the very DNA of the life that grows upon it. The pharmaceutical giants have long viewed Africa as a laboratory and a warehouse of free ingredients. They arrive with smiles and promises of research only to leave with samples that they transform into billions of dollars in profit, while the original owners of the knowledge remain in poverty. But the tide has turned. In a small office in the capital of Ouagadougou, a pen met paper and the rules of the game changed forever. Ibrahim Traoré did not just issue a simple ban. He launched a full-scale nationalization of traditional medicine. The decree was clear. The moringa tree and all its derivatives are the collective property of the Burkinabe people. No foreign entity may claim a patent on the extracts of our soil. This was not a move born of anger, but of a profound sense of duty to protect the legacy of the Sahel. When the news hit the streets of the capital, there was an atmosphere of quiet triumph. You could see it in the eyes of the street vendors and the students at the university. It was the feeling of a long-lost dignity being reclaimed. But across the Atlantic and throughout the European Union, the reaction was one of pure shock and growing resentment. The major pharmaceutical companies were stunned. They had already invested millions in research and development, and they had expected to lock down the moringa market for the next 20 years. They argued that without patents there would be no innovation and that Burkina Faso was violating international trade agreements. They whispered words like isolationism and warned that this would discourage foreign investment. They wanted the world to believe that Traoré was a threat to progress, but the people on the ground knew the truth. Consider the story of a man named Dr. Zerbo, a local researcher and traditional healer who had spent 30 years studying the medicinal properties of local flora. For decades, he had been ignored by the mainstream medical establishment. He had seen foreign scientists come to his village, take his notes, and then disappear. He had been told that his work was unscientific and that only the Western laboratories could produce real medicine. Last month, everything changed. Under the new directive, the government of Burkina Faso did not sue him or marginalize him. Instead, they provided him with the funding and the equipment to lead a new national laboratory. He was given a seat at the table and told that his knowledge was a national treasure. For the first time in his life, he felt like a partner in his country's future rather than a victim of its exploitation. This is the relief that sovereignty brings. It is the transition from being a spectator in your own history to becoming the architect of your own destiny. The government is now building local factories to process moringa into oils and supplements and medicines right there in Burkina Faso. They are creating jobs for the youth and ensuring that the profit stays where the tree grows. It is a simple logic, but it is a logic that threatens the very foundation of the global pharmaceutical monopoly. As the weeks passed, the pressure began to build. The Western powers did not take this sitting down. There were emergency meetings in Geneva and quiet threats whispered in diplomatic circles. Some international organizations hinted that if Burkina Faso did not honor the patent laws of the global north, the flow of medical aid and vaccines might be reconsidered. They called it a matter of global standards, but everyone knew it was a trial of strength. They wanted to see if the young leadership in Ouagadougou would blink. They expected a loud and angry response, but what they received instead was the most powerful weapon in the African arsenal: silence and steady action. Ibrahim Traoré did not go on television to scream at the world. He simply continued to visit the new moringa plantations. He spoke to the farmers. He inspected the processing plants. He acted as if the threats did not exist because he knew that the soil was his ultimate authority. The calm was the power. It was the quiet confidence of a man who knows that you cannot be starved into submission when you have the seeds of your own survival in your pocket. The World Trade Organization sent letters of concern, and the corporate media began to run stories about the dangers of unpatented medicines. But the people of Africa were watching closely. They saw that for the first time a leader was willing to put the health of his grandmother over the dividends of a foreign investor. This moment has become a peak of tension in the ongoing struggle for African independence. It is no longer just about a tree or a medicine. It is about the fundamental question of who owns the world we live in. Is the earth a collection of assets to be fenced off and branded by the highest bidder, or is it a common heritage that belongs to the people who have nurtured it for millennia? If you hit, you write your reaction in one sentence below. Tell me what you think about this. Comment your honest take, because every voice added to this record strengthens the shield of those who stand for justice. This battle for the moringa tree has become a symbol of a much larger awakening. It is an African unity moment that is defying the old maps of power. We are seeing scientists from Mali and Niger and beyond reaching out to coordinate their efforts. They are realizing that if they stand alone, they can be picked off one by one, but if they stand together, they can form an unbreakable wall against those who seek to commodify their existence. The biggest question remains: will the rest of the world have the courage to follow this example, or will we continue to allow our health and our heritage to be sold back to us at a price we cannot afford? The tension is rising, but the spirit of the Sahel is unbowed. The calm is the power, and the revolution has only just begun. The ripples of this single decision are already washing across the borders of Burkina Faso and reshaping the economic landscape of West Africa. What started as a protective decree over a single tree has rapidly evolved into a comprehensive industrial revolution centered around natural sovereignty. For generations, the model was simple and exploitative. African farmers would harvest raw materials, sell them for pennies to foreign middlemen, and watch as those materials were shipped to Europe or the United States to be processed, packaged, and sold at a premium. But Ibrahim Traoré has shattered that cycle. In the weeks following the ban on foreign patents, the government initiated a massive domestic investment program. They are not just protecting the moringa tree. They are building the infrastructure to harvest it, refine it, and market it on their own terms. Across the rural provinces, new cooperatives are forming. Women who once gathered leaves in the blistering sun for a few coins a day are now becoming shareholders in local processing plants. They are operating industrial drying machines, pressing the seeds for high-value oils, and milling the leaves into nutrient-dense powders that are being distributed to local schools to fight malnutrition. The wealth generated by the soil is finally staying on the soil. This is what true independence looks like. It is not just a flag on a pole. It is the ability to feed your children and cure your sick without asking for permission from a foreign bank. Share this with one friend who follows Africa news because the mainstream media will not show you this side of the story. They will not show you the pride swelling in the Sahel, and this pride is highly contagious. The leaders of neighboring Mali and Niger have been watching Ouagadougou very closely. Through the alliance of Sahel states, they are beginning to draft their own legislation to block biopiracy. They recognize that their biodiversity is a strategic asset just as valuable as gold or uranium. There is a growing consensus that the era of the West African botanical free-for-all is officially over. But as this movement gains momentum, the concern in Western capitals is deepening into outright panic. We are not just talking about the loss of a few medicinal patents. We are talking about a structural collapse of a multi-billion-dollar extraction model. The pharmaceutical lobbies in Washington and Paris are calculating their projected losses, and the numbers are staggering. They fear that if Burkina Faso successfully builds an independent natural health industry, other nations across the global south will follow suit. Countries in South America and Southeast Asia are already taking notes. The corporate executives realize that they are losing their grip on the world's natural medicine cabinet. Behind closed doors, there are frantic discussions about how to respond. There are threats of implementing strict new import regulations that would effectively ban African-made supplements from European markets under the guise of health and safety standards. They will try to strangle this new industry before it can walk. They will use the World Health Organization and international trade courts to apply immense pressure. They want to make an example of Ibrahim Traoré to prove that developing nations cannot survive without Western oversight. But what will happen when an entire continent decides that its health and its heritage are no longer for sale at any price? We must look beyond the treaties and the trade disputes to understand the true weight of what is happening here. This is not merely a political maneuver or an economic strategy. It is a profound moral statement about the nature of life itself. For too long, the global system has operated on the assumption that everything can be owned, that everything can be patented, and that the highest bidder has the right to control the building blocks of human health. But the people of Burkina Faso are offering a different philosophy to the world. They are declaring that life is a gift from the Creator and not a commodity for the capitalist class. The roots of a tree, the healing properties of a leaf, and the ancient wisdom of a village healer cannot be copyrighted by a corporation that has never touched the red earth of the Sahel. This is a clash of worldviews. It is the sterile logic of the corporate laboratory against the vibrant, enduring spirit of the African continent. The pressure from the international community will undoubtedly increase in the coming months. There will be diplomatic condemnations, economic threats, and perhaps even attempts to destabilize the region further. The giants of industry do not surrender their monopolies quietly. But if you look closely at the people of Burkina Faso, you will not find fear. You will find a quiet, unshakable determination. They have crossed a threshold, and they cannot be turned back. Consider a young farmer named Seydou, who lives just outside the capital. Last week, he took his young son out to the family plot to plant a new row of moringa saplings. As he pressed the small green shoot into the warm soil, he looked at his boy and told him that this tree was his inheritance. He told him that for the first time in their history, no man in a fine suit from across the ocean could come and claim the rights to the shade it provides or the medicine it yields. Seydou was planting more than a tree. He was planting a mindset of total self-reliance. This is the ultimate victory of Ibrahim Traoré. He has not just rewritten the laws of his country. He has rewritten the narrative in the minds of his people. He has reminded them that they are the custodians of a rich and powerful land, and that their dignity is not something to be negotiated. It is something to be defended. The world is changing rapidly, and the old colonial lies are falling away one by one. The miracle tree stands tall, its roots digging deep into sovereign soil, reaching for a future that is finally undeniably African. Press like and write your city below so your voice is part of this record. Picture a glowing computer screen in a sterile, climate-controlled office in Brussels. On that screen, a flashing red notification indicates a blocked transaction. A keystroke made by an invisible bureaucrat thousands of miles away has just denied a sovereign nation the ability to purchase essential agricultural machinery. Now, contrast that cold, digital denial with a heavy, solid bar of pure yellow gold resting on a wooden table under the hot sun of Ouagadougou. One is an illusion of control based on digital numbers. The other is undeniable physical reality. For decades, the global financial system has operated on a simple, ruthless premise. If you do not comply with the political and economic demands of the West, you are locked out of the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, commonly known as the SWIFT system. You are starved of dollars. You are blocked from euros. You are essentially placed under a modern economic siege. This is exactly the weapon that was aimed at Burkina Faso. The nation desperately needed heavy agricultural equipment to achieve food security and break the cycle of dependency. They needed tractors to break the hard earth, to plant seeds, and to feed a rapidly growing population. They attempted to purchase this machinery on the international open market, but the unseen hands of the global financial architecture moved to block them. The dollar was weaponized. The message from Western financial institutions was clear. Submit to our diplomatic demands, accept our structural adjustment programs, or your fields will remain unplowed and your people will remain hungry. If this story matters for Africa, press like so more people see it. But the architects of this financial blockade severely underestimated the leadership in Burkina Faso. Ibrahim Traoré understood a fundamental truth about wealth that the modern world has seemingly forgotten. True wealth is not a digital digit in a European bank account, subject to the whims of foreign politicians. True wealth is what you can pull from the earth. Consider the story of a gold miner in the rural western region of Burkina Faso. For generations, men in his family have descended into the dark, sweltering earth. With calloused hands and aching backs, they extracted raw gold from the veins of the land. Historically, that gold was immediately loaded onto heavily guarded airplanes. It was flown out of the country, destined for the deep, secure vaults of Switzerland, London, or New York to bolster foreign reserves. The physical wealth of Africa was constantly traded for paper promises and digital credits that could be frozen at a moment's notice. The miner sweated in the dark, the European banker profited in the light, and the African farmer still plowed his field by hand. Traoré looked at this exploitative system and decided it was time to break the wheel. The Western financial institutions thought they had trapped Burkina Faso in an inescapable corner. They believed that by cutting off access to the digital dollar, they could force a proud nation to its knees. They assumed that without their explicit permission and their currency, international trade was mathematically impossible. But how does a nation without access to the global digital banking system feed its people and build its future? The answer came with a shockwave that reverberated from the Sahel all the way to Wall Street and the financial districts of London. Ibrahim Traoré bypassed the dollar entirely. He completely ignored the SWIFT system and the oversight of the International Monetary Fund. Instead, he executed one of the most brilliant and audacious geopolitical moves of the 21st century. He took the raw, physical gold of Burkina Faso and traded it directly for the heavy machinery the country desperately needed. He established a direct, sovereign barter agreement with non-Western manufacturing partners. There were no intermediate banks taking a percentage. There were no foreign policy conditions attached. There were no digital currency conversions subject to foreign treasury oversight. It was a pure, unadulterated exchange of physical value. Millions of dollars worth of pure African gold were exchanged directly for thousands of heavy-duty agricultural tractors. When the first massive shipment of these machines arrived, the reaction on the ground was nothing short of electric. Imagine a farmer named Seydou in a remote village near Bobo Dioulasso. Seydou is 60 years old. For 40 years, he has worked the hard, dry soil with nothing but a short-handled hoe. His back bears the permanent curve of a lifetime of grueling manual labor. He has listened to decades of foreign aid workers and politicians making empty promises about agricultural modernization, while his crop yields barely kept his family alive. Then, one morning, the ground shakes. A massive, roaring, green and yellow tractor rolls into his village, kicking up the red dust. Seydou approaches it, placing his weathered hand on the warm metal of the engine hood. He is told by local officials that this machine does not belong to a foreign corporation. It does not come with a crippling high-interest loan from the World Bank. It was purchased outright with the gold mined from his own country's soil. For the first time in his life, Seydou sees the tangible wealth of Africa working directly for the people of Africa. The pride in his eyes is mirrored across the entire nation. The people of Burkina Faso realized they had broken a massive psychological chain. Meanwhile, the reaction in the corridors of power in Washington and Paris was a mixture of absolute confusion and rising panic. Financial analysts and geopolitical strategists were stunned by the simplicity and effectiveness of the maneuver. The entire architecture of Western financial dominance relies heavily on the assumption that global trade must absolutely be conducted in dollars or euros. The SWIFT system is only powerful if nations are forced to rely upon it. By conducting a massive transaction using physical gold, Burkina Faso had just exposed a fatal flaw in the Western financial weapon. You cannot freeze a physical gold bar that is already secured on a cargo plane heading to a sovereign trade partner. You cannot sanction a tractor that has already been unloaded at a port and is driving steadily toward a rural farm. The illusion of absolute Western financial control was shattered in broad daylight. Financial newspapers scrambled to explain how a developing African nation had managed to completely outmaneuver the most sophisticated financial blockades on Earth. They realized that the CFA franc monopoly, the colonial currency system that has drained West African wealth for decades, was losing its ultimate grip. The people of Burkina Faso were not just surviving the economic sanctions, they were actively thriving entirely outside the system meant to contain them. What happens when the architects of the global financial system realize their greatest weapon has just been disarmed? The immediate response from the West was a rapid and aggressive diplomatic escalation. Emergency meetings were quickly convened behind closed doors at the United States Department of the Treasury and the headquarters of the European Central Bank. Diplomats in Brussels drafted frantic memos. The fear among these institutions was palpable and deep. If Burkina Faso successfully proved that a nation could survive, modernize, and trade without the dollar, without the euro, and without Western banking systems, the entire neo-colonial financial structure would be at risk of imminent collapse. Western leaders began issuing veiled warnings through international media. They spoke ominously of secondary sanctions. They threatened to penalize any international logistics companies, insurers, or shipping lines that facilitated these direct gold for goods transfers. They attempted to use their considerable influence within the World Trade Organization to label the sovereign transaction as irregular, dangerous, or illicit. Western intelligence agencies were reportedly tasked with tracking the physical movement of the gold, desperately trying to find a logistical choke point where they could intervene and stop the flow of heavy machinery into West Africa. The pressure was immense and coordinated. The geopolitical heavyweights of the world were bearing down on Ouagadougou, determined to crush this rebellion against the fiat currency system before it could inspire other resource-rich nations to do the same. But amidst this raging storm of Western panic and diplomatic threats, the response from Ibrahim Traoré and the government of Burkina Faso was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They did not shout. They did not issue angry counterthreats or engage in petty diplomatic squabbles. They simply remained calm. Tell me what you think about this. Comment your honest take. This unshakable calmness was their ultimate power. While Western politicians screamed into microphones about international norms and financial regulations, Burkina Faso simply broadcasted high-definition television footage of the new tractors plowing thousands of acres of previously unused, fertile land. They showed local engineers training young Burkinabe farmers how to maintain and repair the heavy diesel engines. They showed the tangible, undeniable proof of national progress. The silence from the presidential palace in Ouagadougou was deafening to the West. It was the heavy, confident silence of a leadership that knows it holds the ultimate high ground. They possessed real gold, they had acquired real tractors, and they were growing real food in their own soil. The West, in contrast, only possessed paper threats and digital anger. This unshakable resolve triggered a massive wave of relief and unity across the African continent. The citizens of neighboring nations within the alliance of Sahel states, particularly Mali and Niger, watched the events unfold with intense pride. They saw a fellow African nation standing incredibly tall against the combined giants of global finance and winning decisively. The military and political leaders in Bamako and Niamey quickly realized the profound, world-shifting implications of this gold pact. Mali holds vast, untapped gold reserves. Niger possesses critical uranium and massive oil deposits. For the very first time in modern history, a clear and proven blueprint existed for bypassing the exploitative financial systems that had deliberately kept their populations impoverished for generations. The unity among the Sahel states rapidly solidified. They were no longer just a military alliance formed to combat regional terrorism. They were rapidly transforming into an economic fortress based on hard assets, mutual respect, and collective survival. The realization swept through the dusty streets and bustling markets of West Africa that the invisible, suffocating chains of financial dependency were finally snapping. They were actively witnessing the birth of an entirely new economic paradigm, one where the inherent wealth of the land finally serves the people who walk upon it. If physical gold can buy heavy tractors today, completely bypassing the dollar and the dictates of foreign banks, what will it buy tomorrow, and who will be left holding the empty paper? The immediate domestic transformation across Burkina Faso was nothing short of revolutionary. Within weeks of the heavy machinery arriving, the physical landscape of the nation began to change dramatically. Vast tracts of arid land, previously deemed too difficult to cultivate by hand, were suddenly being turned over by the massive steel blades of the new tractors. Young men and women who had previously migrated to overcrowded urban centers looking for scarce jobs and foreign aid began returning to their ancestral villages in massive numbers. They were not returning to the grinding poverty of their parents, but to a modernized agricultural sector that promised real yields, real income, and true dignity. Local markets, once heavily dependent on expensive imported grains dictated by